He tossed $100 bill into a puddle of spilled wine at my feet. He looked at me with sheer disgust and told me to clean up the mess and leave through the servant entrance. He sneered that a man like me did not belong in a $10 million mansion. He had no idea that I was the one who secretly bought that exact mansion. He had no idea who I really was. But when he finally stood before me in my federal courtroom, his arrogant smirk melted into absolute terror. The tables had turned, and now he was the one on trial. Justice was served. My name is Everett Sinclair. I am 69 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth based on your appearance. I was on my knees wiping up a puddle of expensive red wine from the imported Italian marble floor. The crystal glass had shattered, spreading sharp fragments across the foyer. All around me, a lavish housewarming party was in full swing. A live string quartet played classical music in the corner. Wealthy guests, dressed in designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos, mingled, holding crystal champagne flutes and discussing their latest stock market victories. I was wearing my favorite faded red flannel shirt and a pair of worn denim jeans. As an older black man, quietly picking up shards of glass on his hands and knees, I was entirely invisible to them. The catering staff assumed I was part of the cleanup crew. The elite guests treated me like a ghost, stepping over me without a second glance. That was exactly how I preferred it. I had come tonight simply to see the new home of my daughter Jada and her new husband Bradley. It was a sprawling estate with vaulted ceilings and manicured grounds, a home I had secretly purchased through a blind trust to ensure my only child had a secure and beautiful future. I wanted to stay in the background, to observe her happiness without casting a shadow over her celebration. But my quiet observation was about to be violently interrupted. A pair of highly polished Italian leather shoes stepped into my line of sight, stopping just inches from my calloused hands. I looked up slowly. Standing over me was Bradley Kensington, my new son-in-law. He was 35 years old, a Wall Street fund manager, impeccably groomed with perfectly styled hair, and a permanent sneer of superiority resting on his face. We had never officially met. Jada had married him in a whirlwind European elopement just 2 months ago. Bradley looked down at me with utter disdain. "You missed a spot," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I do not know which agency sent you, but your uniform is an absolute disgrace. You look like a vagrant who wandered in off the street to steal the silverware." He did not lower his voice. The music seemed to fade as a few guests turned their heads to watch the spectacle with quiet amusement. Bradley puffed out his chest, basking in the attention of his peers. "This is a $10 million property," he boasted loudly, claiming ownership of a house he did not spend a single dime to acquire. "We do not tolerate incompetence here. Clean this up quickly, take the trash out, and leave through the service entrance where you belong. You are just a servant. Do not let me see you walking through the main halls again." To seal his humiliation, he reached into his tailored tuxedo pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and let it flutter from his fingers. It landed right in the puddle of spilled wine, soaking up the red liquid. "Buy yourself a decent shirt on the way home," he sneered, turning his back to me to greet a wealthy investor. I looked down at the soaked bill. My hands, which had spent a lifetime tending my garden, fixing plumbing, and holding the gavel of justice, remained perfectly steady. The primal urge to stand up and strip away his arrogant facade was incredibly powerful. I could have told him right then and there that the marble floor he was standing on belonged to me. I could have told him that I possessed the legal authority to crush his entire Wall Street firm before Monday morning. But true power does not need to shout. True power observes and calculates. As a judge, I was trained to gather evidence before delivering a verdict. I kept my face entirely impassive. I slowly reached out, picked up the stained $100 bill, and slipped it into my jeans pocket. "Yes, sir," I replied evenly. "Right away." As I gathered the broken crystal into the dustpan, my eyes scanned the massive ballroom. A disturbing realization settled over me. Where was Jada? This was supposed to be her celebration too. She was a brilliant pediatric surgeon, a woman of immense grace and vibrant energy. She usually commanded any room she walked into, but she was nowhere to be seen. The host of the party was mingling, laughing, and drinking with his wealthy friends, entirely unbothered by his wife's absence. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Something was deeply wrong in this marriage. My daughter was hiding somewhere in this massive house, and this arrogant man was parading around in a kingdom built on my silent generosity. I stood up, taking the dustpan and the shattered glass with me. I did not look back at Bradley or his laughing guests. I walked through the massive professional kitchen, past the bustling caterers, and exited through the heavy metal door at the back of the house. The night air was crisp and biting. I walked down the long, manicured driveway toward my old reliable Ford pickup truck parked discreetly on the dark street. Bradley Kensington thought he had just humiliated a poor, uneducated laborer. He thought he had asserted his social dominance over a weak old man. He had absolutely no idea that the man he just ordered out the back door was Everett Sinclair. He did not know I was a senior federal judge. He did not know that corporate executives with 10 times his wealth and influence trembled when they entered my courtroom. He only saw the color of my skin and the frayed collar of my shirt. He made a judgment based on his own prejudice and greed. It was the biggest mistake of his life. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, staring at the glowing lights of the mansion. The street lights cast long, dark shadows over my dashboard. I pulled out my phone and dialed a private number I rarely used. A voice answered immediately on the first ring. "This is Sinclair," I said, my voice cold and absolute in the silent truck. "Contact the trust administrators in Geneva. I want the $50 million account frozen immediately. Block all incoming requests for withdrawals from Jada or her husband. Cut the financial lifeline." The very next morning, the financial guillotine I had quietly dropped began its brutal work. Across town at an exclusive luxury car dealership, Bradley sat in a plush leather chair, sipping an espresso. He was finalizing the purchase of a custom-built Porsche, a trivial toy to celebrate his supposed success and new mansion. He confidently slid his sleek black titanium credit card across the glass desk to the sales manager, expecting the usual fawning obedience. Instead, the manager returned a few minutes later, looking incredibly uncomfortable and pale. "Sir, your card has been declined," he whispered, leaning in to avoid causing a scene among the other wealthy patrons. Bradley laughed it off, pulling out a second premium corporate card. "Run it again," he ordered, his arrogance momentarily undisturbed. But the second card was also declined. Then a third. The color completely drained from his perfectly tanned face. For a man whose entire identity was built on the fragile illusion of limitless wealth, the words "insufficient funds" were a death sentence. He snatched his cards back, barking a hollow, angry excuse about a banking error before storming out of the showroom. His panicked phone calls to his financial advisors went straight to voicemail. The invisible vault door had slammed shut. 2 hours later, a frantic, desperate knock echoed through my modest suburban home. I opened the front door to find Jada standing on my porch. She looked nothing like the brilliant, confident surgeon I had raised. Her expensive designer clothes were disheveled, and her eyes were red and swollen from heavy crying. She threw her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder as she sobbed uncontrollably. I brought her inside and sat her down at the worn oak dining table, the same table where she used to study late into the night. I poured her a cup of hot chamomile tea. She took the mug with trembling hands. As the sleeve of her silk blouse slid up, my heart stopped completely. A dark purple bruise, shaped precisely like the cruel grip of a large hand, stained her delicate wrist. The sight of that mark sent a jolt of pure white hot rage straight to my core. Every protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to hunt Bradley down and break the hands that dared to touch my child. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my face to remain absolutely neutral. I could not react like an angry father right now. I needed to react like a federal judge. Jada pulled her sleeve down quickly, looking deeply ashamed. "I am sorry, Dad," she whispered. "Bradley is under a lot of stress right now. His credit cards were suddenly frozen this morning, and he lost his mind. He told me I needed to authorize an emergency withdrawal from the trust fund Mom left me. He said we would lose everything if I did not sign the papers today. He grabbed me when I told him I needed to speak to you first." I looked at my daughter, noting the raw fear shaking her voice. She was trapped in a cycle of manipulation, protecting the monster who was destroying her. I sat across from her, interlacing my fingers on the tabletop. My voice was calm, measured, and entirely devoid of the fury threatening to consume me. It was the exact tone I used when questioning hostile and elusive witnesses on the stand. "It is all right, Jada," I said softly. Stress can make people act out of character. But, as your designated trustee, I need to understand the full financial picture before I sign anything. What exactly does Bradley need the money for? Jada looked down at her tea. She was hesitant, bound by the twisted loyalty abusers instill in their victims. He manages a large hedge fund, she explained, her voice shaking slightly. He told me a few major investments went under last quarter. He borrowed money on margin to cover the unexpected losses, but the market turned against him. He needs $50 million to balance the books and satisfy his extremely aggressive creditors. I nodded, slowly, processing the magnitude of the lies she had been fed. A legitimate fund manager would have insurance and corporate backing to cover market fluctuations. The sudden, desperate need for $50 million in liquid cash meant only one thing. Bradley was not investing money. He was running a massive, illegal Ponzi scheme, and his fraudulent house of cards was rapidly collapsing. He had married my daughter solely to access her massive inheritance and plug the gaping hole in his criminal enterprise. "Did he ask you to sign any documents putting your name on his company accounts?" I asked, guiding her gently toward the terrifying truth. She wiped a tear from her cheek and nodded. "Yes, he made me a silent partner a few months ago. He said it was for tax benefits. He said it meant we were building our future, together." The trap was perfectly set. Bradley had intentionally tied Jada to his sinking ship, preparing to make her the scapegoat when the federal authorities inevitably came knocking. I stood up and walked around the table, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on her shoulder. The pieces of the puzzle were perfectly aligned in my mind. Bradley was a cornered animal, and cornered animals made fatal mistakes. "Listen to me carefully, Jada," I said, my voice projecting absolute safety and unwavering authority. "You are my daughter, and I will do whatever it takes to protect you. If Bradley needs my signature on the trust release forms to keep your home safe, then I will provide it without hesitation. You do not need to carry this massive burden alone." Jada looked up at me, a wave of profound relief washing over her tear-stained face. She hugged me tightly, thanking me repeatedly for understanding. She believed I was simply an old, uneducated man giving in to save her marriage. She did not realize I was carefully baiting a legal trap for her abuser. "Tell Bradley to bring the authorization papers directly to me," I instructed her. "I want to look them over and sign them in person. Tell him I understand the urgency, and I will not stand in his way." Jada nodded, wiping her eyes and grabbing her coat to leave, feeling a false sense of security. As she turned to the hallway mirror to quickly fix her smudged makeup, I quietly picked up her designer handbag from the kitchen counter. With practiced precision, I reached into my pocket and retrieved a tiny magnetic GPS tracker, coupled with a long-range audio transmitter. I slipped the advanced device deep into the hidden lining of her purse, ensuring it was entirely undetectable. I zipped the bag closed just as she turned around. I handed it to her with a warm, fatherly smile. "Drive safely, sweetie," I told her. "Let us see exactly what your husband does next." Less than an hour after Jada left my home, the heavy thud of a car door slamming echoed outside my front window. The engine of an expensive rideshare vehicle sped away, leaving only the aggressive and rapid stomping of Italian leather shoes approaching my porch. Bradley did not even bother to knock. He threw the front door open, marching into my modest living room like a conquering general invading a peasant village. He looked frantic, but tried his absolute hardest to mask his panic with an air of supreme arrogance. His expensive silk tie was loosened, and his normally pristine hair was slightly out of place from his desperate mourning. Without a single word of greeting, he marched straight into my kitchen and slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto my worn oak dining table. The violent impact rattled the coffee mugs I had just washed and set out to dry. "Sign these right now," he demanded, his voice tight with barely suppressed rage and desperation. I looked up from the kitchen sink, slowly drying my hands on a simple cloth towel. He glared at me, his eyes full of that exact same disgust he had shown at the mansion party. "Do not stand there looking stupid, old man," he barked. "We do not have time for your slow comprehension," he continued, his face turning a shade of angry red. I walked over to the table, keeping my posture entirely submissive and my head slightly lowered. Bradley hovered over me, intentionally invading my personal space to establish physical dominance. "Jada told me you agreed to release the trust funds," he said, tapping a manicured finger violently against the top page of the contract. Do not think for a single second that you are doing me a favor today. You are doing this because I am the best thing that ever happened to your daughter, and if you ruin my business, I will make sure she loses everything. I will strip her of that house, her reputation, and her pristine little medical career. You think you understand how the real world works because you fixed a few pipes and mowed a few lawns in your pathetic life. You know absolutely nothing. I operate on Wall Street. We are the elite. We move billions of dollars before you even wake up to drink your cheap coffee. We control the economy, the politicians, and the laws. Men like me are untouchable. We build empires while people like you just sweep the floors. He leaned closer, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of nervous sweat radiating from his skin. If this capital does not hit my offshore accounts by the end of the business day, my investors will dismantle my firm. I will not let an uneducated laborer stand in the way of my legacy. Pick up the pen and sign exactly where I highlighted. If you hesitate, I will divorce Jada tomorrow. I will bury her in litigation so deep she will never see the inside of an operating room again. I will take every dime she ever earns. You have no power here, Everett. You are just a relic holding the keys to a vault you do not even understand. Give me what is mine right now. I did not react to his venomous threats. I simply reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my wire-rimmed reading glasses. I slid them onto my face and picked up the thick stack of papers. Just let me read what I am signing, I said, keeping my voice quiet and entirely docile. Bradley rolled his eyes and let out a loud, exasperated sigh, pacing the length of my small kitchen like a caged predator. As my eyes scanned the legal jargon, my physical demeanor remained completely passive, but my mind shifted instantly into the sharp, analytical gear of a senior federal judge. Bradley assumed these documents were written in a complex financial language that a working-class man could never possibly decipher. He was entirely wrong. Underneath the dense layers of corporate terminology, the true nature of his operation was painfully obvious to someone with my extensive judicial background. This was not a standard emergency capital injection. It was a highly sophisticated transnational money laundering vehicle. I tracked the routing numbers listed in the subclauses. The funds were designed to be bounced through a series of anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware, then funneled directly into a numbered corporate account in the Cayman Islands. He had structured the massive transfer to look like a legitimate corporate investment made by Jada as the primary director. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme exit strategy. He was preparing to drain the $50 million, wash it through untraceable Caribbean banks, and leave his wife holding the bag, when the federal investigators inevitably followed the paper trail. He had crafted a legal document designed to completely absolve him of liability, while framing my daughter for securities fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. It was a brilliant piece of white-collar crime, authored by a man who genuinely believed he was the smartest person in any room. He was about to find out that arrogance is the ultimate blinding agent. I flipped to the final page of the contract, where a series of signature lines awaited my authorization as the primary trust custodian. I picked up the heavy brass pen Bradley had carelessly tossed onto the wooden table. "Are you done pretending to read those words?" he snapped, stopping his frantic pacing to glare at me with utter contempt. "Just sign the damn paper so I can get back to saving our lives and managing real wealth." I did not say a single word in response. I smoothly pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed my full legal name on the dotted line. The moment the dark ink left the pen, Bradley lunged forward like a starving animal and snatched the documents right out from under my hands. He quickly checked the signature page, a triumphant and deeply ugly smirk spreading across his face. "That is a good boy," he mocked, hastily slipping the papers into his sleek leather briefcase. "Next time, do not make me come all the way down to this depressing neighborhood to get what I want. Stay out of my way, old man." Without another word, he turned on his heel and marched out the front door, slamming it shut behind him. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen and allowed a cold, calculated smile to finally break across my face. Bradley Kensington thought he had just secured his $50 million escape route. He was entirely oblivious to the reality of what I had just given him. Alongside my signature, I had quietly appended a highly specific alphanumeric sequence. It was a classified federal judicial cipher. By submitting that exact document to any financial institution, Bradley was not executing a transfer. He was legally submitting a sworn confession of federal wire fraud directly to the United States Department of Justice. I sat in the dim light of my home office and slipped a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones over my ears. I activated the secure surveillance application on my encrypted laptop, connecting directly to the long-range audio transmitter I had hidden deep inside the lining of Jada's designer handbag. My daughter had returned to her mansion to rest before her evening shift at the hospital, leaving her purse carelessly on the massive marble kitchen island. She was fast asleep upstairs, completely exhausted by the emotional abuse and manipulation she had endured that morning. But down in the sprawling living room of the $10 million estate I had secretly purchased, her husband was wide awake, and he was certainly not alone. The crisp, high-definition audio feed captured the unmistakable sound of clinking crystal glasses, followed by breathy laughter and the distinct rustling of expensive clothing. It was not my daughter laughing. It was a woman with a sharp, nasal voice. I recognized her immediately from the extensive background checks Kenneth had run on Bradley's firm prior to the wedding. It was Chloe, his chief accountant, and supposedly his most trusted corporate ally. Their conversation quickly devolved into the grotesque and unmistakable sounds of an illicit physical affair, unfolding right on the imported Italian sofa I had paid for. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was staggering. He was violating his marriage vows under the very roof I had provided, while his exhausted wife slept merely one floor above them. The sickening sounds of their intimacy eventually subsided, giving way to the cold clinking of ice in freshly poured whiskey glasses. Chloe let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed violently through my headphones. "You really pushed the old man today," she said, her voice dripping with venomous amusement. "Are you absolutely sure he did not suspect anything when he signed the trust release forms?" Bradley scoffed heavily, his boundless arrogance bleeding through the digital transmission. "He is a retired laborer, Chloe. The man wears cheap flannel to a black tie event and drives a truck that belongs in a scrapyard. He probably cannot even spell the word offshore, let alone understand a transnational corporate routing schematic. He just signed his daughter's life away because he was too terrified I would divorce her and leave her broken." Chloe hummed in greedy agreement. "Good, because the federal regulators have been sniffing around our shell companies in Delaware since Tuesday. We need to initiate the wire transfer to the Cayman accounts by midnight tonight, or the entire firm goes down in flames." I listened with a heart made of absolute ice, as Bradley outlined the final stage of his masterful deception. "Everything is perfectly aligned," he bragged, pouring another expensive drink. "I forged Jada's signature on the executive board approvals 2 weeks ago. When the FBI inevitably raids the firm tomorrow morning, they will find a perfectly documented paper trail proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Dr. Jada Sinclair orchestrated the entire $50 million embezzlement scheme. She is the official director on paper. By the time they arrest her and freeze her domestic assets, you and I will be drinking champagne on a private sun-drenched beach in Dubai. She will be facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, and her clueless father will be begging on the streets for pennies to hire a public defender. The sheer predatory cruelty of his plan was breathtaking. He had meticulously groomed my daughter, manipulated her into marriage, isolated her from my protection, and forged her identity solely to use her as a human shield against federal prosecution. He was perfectly willing to sacrifice an innocent, brilliant doctor to save his own miserable skin. I pulled the headphones down, resting them around my neck, and picked up my secure phone. I dialed Kenneth Alvarez. Kenneth was not just my personal attorney or a standard legal consultant. He was a former ruthless federal prosecutor who had served as my right-hand man during my most high-profile organized crime trials on the federal bench. We had put away untouchable mob bosses, corrupt politicians, and arrogant billionaires together. When Kenneth answered, his voice was razor-sharp and entirely alert. "Everett," he said simply, "tell me we have a green light to execute the protocol." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the flashing green light of the audio transmitter program on my screen. "The rat took the bait, Kenneth," I said calmly, maintaining the absolute clinical detachment required of a judge. "Bradley is preparing to wire the $50 million to his Cayman Islands accounts at exactly midnight tonight. He has officially framed Jada as the primary executor of the fraud, using forged corporate signatures. I need you to contact our deep allies at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network immediately." Kenneth chuckled, a low, dangerous sound that promised absolute ruin for his targets. "I already have the emergency injunctions drafted and waiting, Everett. As soon as Bradley initiates the transfer using the document you signed, the banking algorithm will immediately trigger your hidden judicial cipher. The funds will never reach the Caribbean. They will be intercepted mid-wire and securely rerouted into an impenetrable federal holding account under your direct jurisdiction. He will think the money transferred successfully, but his offshore accounts will remain completely empty." "What about the pending arrest warrants?" Kenneth asked, shifting to a highly serious tone. "Bradley clearly thinks he is feeding Jada to the wolves tomorrow morning." "Let him think that," I replied, my voice as hard and unforgiving as granite. "Let the FBI move in and execute the arrest warrants, precisely as Bradley orchestrated them. We need the trap to snap shut completely, to trigger the massive federal conspiracy charges against him. Protect her physically from the shadows, but let the initial arrest happen exactly according to his timeline. It is the only guaranteed way to expose his forged documents and secure a watertight indictment that he can never escape." "Understood," Kenneth replied briskly. "The board is set, Everett." Later that evening, miles away from the treacherous and greedy schemes unfolding in her own home, Jada stood under the blinding surgical lights of the city hospital operating room. She was entirely in her element, surrounded by the rhythmic, steady beeping of heart monitors and the sharp, sterile smell of antiseptic. Her incredibly steady hands meticulously repaired a severe congenital heart defect in a fragile 6-year-old boy. She was a brilliant surgeon, a woman who dedicated every ounce of her energy and intellect to saving the lives of others. She had pushed through her physical exhaustion and the severe emotional trauma of her mourning, finding deep solace and purpose in the singular critical focus required at the operating table. She genuinely believed the terrifying nightmare with Bradley was over. She believed her uneducated father had simply submitted to Bradley's demands, solved the sudden financial crisis, and saved her fragile marriage from collapse. She had absolutely no idea that her husband had just finalized the deceptive paperwork designed to destroy her entire existence and lock her in a cage. As she carefully sutured the final delicate valve securing the young boy's future, the atmosphere in the hospital corridors immediately outside her operating room drastically shifted. The normal, bustling, comforting sounds of chatting nurses and rolling medical carts were abruptly replaced by the heavy, synchronized footsteps of tactical boots, marching aggressively down the polished linoleum floor. The heavy double doors of the surgical suite suddenly burst open, violently breaking the sterile seal of the room. A team of stern-faced men and women wearing dark suits and heavy tactical vests swarmed into the space, demanding immediate compliance. The lead agent stepped forward, holding up a gold badge that gleamed sharply and menacingly under the bright surgical lights. "Dr. Jada Sinclair," the agent, announced his voice, echoing with absolute unyielding authority. "Step away from the patient immediately, and put your hands exactly where I can see them. You are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for grand larceny, massive securities fraud, and the illegal embezzlement of $50 million. The harsh fluorescent lights hummed endlessly above Jada. She had been brutally stripped of her sterile surgical scrubs and forced into a stiff, oversized orange jumpsuit. The cheap fabric scratched her skin, serving as a constant degrading reminder of her new reality. She sat on a cold metal bench, hugging her knees tightly to her chest. Just hours ago, she was carefully saving a child's life in an operating room. Now she was locked inside a federal holding cell, treated exactly like a hardened criminal. The bright flashes of the mugshot camera and the cold ink of the fingerprinting station still burned in her memory. The utter humiliation of being paraded in heavy steel handcuffs through the main hospital lobby in front of her shocked colleagues had broken her spirit. Her mind spun in chaotic, terrifying circles. $50 million, grand larceny, securities fraud. The harsh legal words felt like a foreign language. She had dedicated her entire life to healing, to building a pristine, unshakable reputation. How did this happen? She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, silent sobs. The heavy steel door to the visitation room buzzed loudly, jolting her from her deep despair. A stern guard stepped inside, gesturing for her to move toward the thick plexiglass divider. Someone was here to see her. She desperately prayed it was her father, but as she looked through the smudged glass, her heart sank completely. Bradley sat casually on the other side of the bulletproof glass. He looked perfectly put together, in a sharply tailored navy suit, a stark and insulting contrast to her degrading prison uniform. He picked up the telephone receiver attached to the metal partition. His face was instantly twisted into a masterful mask of deep, manufactured sorrow. "Jada, my God, what happened to you?" he pleaded, his voice cracking with perfectly feigned emotion. "I have been calling everyone since I heard the news. The firm is in total, absolute chaos. The FBI tore through our corporate offices this morning, seizing everything." Jada grabbed the receiver, her hands trembling violently against the hard plastic. "Bradley, you have to fix this immediately," she begged. "Tell the federal agents I had absolutely nothing to do with the finances. I just signed the corporate papers you gave me for the tax benefits. You swore we were building a future together." Bradley let out a heavy theatrical sigh, rubbing his temples as if carrying the massive weight of the world on his shoulders. "I know, sweetheart, I know. But the federal agents found the executive board approvals. Your official signature is on every single authorization for the offshore Cayman transfers. They firmly believe you orchestrated the entire $50 million embezzlement to secretly fund your expensive medical research programs. I tried to tell them it was a terrible mistake, but they have a mountain of undeniable paper trails linking directly to you." He slid a thick, intimidating legal document through the narrow metal slot beneath the glass. "I hired the most aggressive defense attorney in the city to look at your case. He says the evidence is entirely insurmountable. If you take this to a jury trial, they will definitely make an example out of you. You will face 20 brutal years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. But there is another way out." He leaned much closer to the glass, his eyes pleading with cold, calculated desperation. "The lead prosecutor is offering a fast plea deal. If you sign this full confession right now, they will drop the major charges. You will only serve 5 short years in a minimum security facility. It is the only guaranteed way to protect our family reputation from total ruin. I will wait for you, I promise. I will take care of your wealth on the outside. You just have to take the fall today to save us both." Jada stared blankly at the thick plea agreement, the dense legal words swimming before her tear-filled eyes. 5 long years in a federal prison. Her hard-earned medical license would be permanently revoked. Her entire life, her pristine reputation, her future would be utterly and completely destroyed. She reached slowly for the cheap plastic pen Bradley had confidently slid through the metal slot, her spirit completely shattered by his masterful manipulation. Before the dark ink could even touch the stark white paper, the heavy steel door on Bradley's side of the secure visitation room swung open with a resounding metallic thud. I stepped into the sterile concrete room, my expression as hard and unyielding as winter ice. I was still wearing my faded red flannel shirt and worn denim jeans, holding a simple, scratched leather briefcase. Jada immediately dropped the pen, letting out a sharp, desperate gasp of pure relief. "Dad," she cried out, pressing her trembling hand against the thick, bulletproof glass. Bradley slowly turned around his carefully crafted mask of sorrow, vanishing in an instant. It was quickly replaced by a deep, ugly sneer of pure, unadulterated superiority. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," he mocked, standing up straight and proudly buttoning his expensive designer suit jacket. "The loyal little servant arrives to save the day. What exactly are you going to do about this old man? Are you going to mop the floors of the precinct until the guards feel sorry and let her go? This is the weight of the federal government, not a spilled glass of wine at a society dinner party. You do not belong anywhere near this building." I did not say a single word in response. I walked calmly and deliberately toward the partition, my posture entirely straight, radiating a silent, terrifying authority that Bradley was far too arrogant and blind to recognize. He stepped aggressively into my path, intentionally trying to block my physical view of my daughter. "You should leave right now," he spat, his voice dropping to a vicious, threatening whisper. "She is about to sign a plea deal that will miraculously keep her out of a maximum security hellhole. You do not even have the money to hire a cheap traffic lawyer, let alone a top-tier federal defense team. I have everything perfectly under control. Go back to your rundown house and let the people with real, actual power handle this situation. You are vastly out of your league." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not even look Bradley in the eye. I kept my intense gaze fixed entirely on my daughter, who was watching the tense exchange with wide, terrified eyes. My absolute silence hung heavily in the small concrete room, suffocating and thick, completely neutralizing his arrogant verbal threats. For a man who thrived on constant intimidation and loud corporate dominance, my complete lack of a physical or emotional reaction was deeply unsettling to him. Finally, I turned my head just a fraction, looking past his expensive tailored suit, as if he were nothing more than a minor microscopic annoyance, a stray piece of trash resting on the sidewalk. "Get out of my way," I said. My voice was incredibly low, entirely devoid of any typical anger, but it carried the absolute, undeniable weight of a man who commanded ultimate judicial authority. Bradley opened his mouth to hurl another vile insult, but the sheer freezing coldness radiating from my calm demeanor made the cruel words die instantly in his throat. He took an involuntary step back, suddenly feeling very small and insignificant in his flashy clothes. I stepped directly up to the glass partition and picked up the heavy plastic receiver. "Do not sign a single page of that garbage, Jada," I instructed her, my voice echoing with absolute, unshakable certainty. "This nightmare ends right now." Bradley scoffed nervously, trying desperately to regain his shattered composure. "You are completely delusional, old man. You cannot possibly save her from the FBI." Without acknowledging his existence for even a second, I turned my head to the armed security guard standing diligently by the steel door. "Remove this man from the premises immediately," I ordered. Bradley laughed out loud at my bold command, shaking his head at my apparent pathetic audacity. But his arrogant laughter died instantly when I reached into my scratched leather briefcase and walked straight out of the visitation room toward the main precinct desk. The imposing chief of police looked up highly annoyed by the sudden interruption. I did not speak a single word. I simply pulled out my solid gold credential and slammed my senior federal judge badge directly onto the hard wooden desk. The chief immediately shot to his feet, the color completely draining from his shocked face. "Release my daughter right now," I commanded. "I am invoking absolute judicial immunity." The heavy steel doors of the precinct closed firmly behind us, leaving the absolute nightmare of the federal holding cell in the past. A sleek black government SUV with heavily tinted windows was idling at the curb, with a heavily armed federal marshal holding the rear door open. Jada climbed inside, still trembling visibly in the civilian clothes the guards had hastily returned to her. We drove in absolute silence through the neon-lit city streets, executing a complex counter-surveillance route, until we pulled into the secure underground garage of a towering, ultra-luxury high-rise downtown. The private biometric elevator shot up to the top floor, opening directly into a sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city skyline. Jada stepped out, her jaw dropping, as she took in the expensive modern art, the minimalist leather furniture, and the impenetrable state-of-the-art security system. "Dad, whose apartment is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as she looked at my faded flannel shirt. "It is mine, Jada," I replied, gently, taking her coat. "I bought it years ago under a classified blind corporate trust. I am not the poor retired laborer your husband thought he could easily discard and intimidate. I am a senior judge for the United States Federal Court, and this is your highly secure safe house." I led her to the massive living room and sat her down on the plush sofa. I knew the terrible truth I was about to reveal would be agonizing, but a skilled surgeon knows you must cut deep to remove a deadly spreading cancer. I opened my encrypted laptop and placed it on the glass coffee table. "Jada, there is something you urgently need to hear," I said, keeping my voice steady and completely objective. I pressed play. The pristine, high-definition audio of her own mansion living room filled the penthouse. First came the unmistakable graphic sounds of physical intimacy between her husband and Chloe, his chief corporate accountant. Jada flinched violently, as if she had been physically struck, crossing her arms tight against her chest to shield herself. But the real devastation came seconds later. She heard Bradley call me a wretched old man and a clueless, pathetic laborer. She heard him brag with absolute arrogance about forging her signature on the executive board documents. She heard him coldly outline his master plan to frame her for the $50 million embezzlement and send her to a maximum security prison while he fled to a private beach in Dubai. The color drained entirely from Jada's beautiful face. The man she had loved, the man she had married, and trusted with her entire future, was a calculated, ruthless predator, a sickening monster who was fully prepared to sacrifice her freedom and her medical license to save his own miserable skin. Heavy tears streamed down her cheeks, but as the audio continued playing, something fundamental shifted deeply inside her. The profound sorrow and confusion in her eyes slowly hardened, morphing into a cold, piercing stare. The grand illusion of her perfect marriage shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there on the sofa. The devastating pain of his ultimate betrayal crystallized into a pure, burning, unyielding hatred. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her jaw setting with a newfound fierce resolve. "He completely destroyed my life," she whispered, her voice devoid of any previous weakness or fear. "Now we completely destroy his," I replied, closing the laptop. Across the city, absolute panic was rapidly consuming Bradley Kensington. His flawless exit strategy had just been completely derailed. The FBI raid at his corporate headquarters had gone exactly as he planned, but the crucial centerpiece of his criminal defense was suddenly missing. Jada was no longer in federal custody. She had seemingly vanished into thin air without a trace. His frantic, angry phone calls to the precinct were stonewalled by tight-lipped officers who refused to disclose who had authorized her immediate release. Without Jada locked in a cell, bearing the full weight of the massive fraud, the highly trained federal investigators would inevitably start looking much closer at his personal offshore financial records. He was a trapped, desperate rat, pacing the imported marble floors of the mansion I had bought. Desperation always breeds spectacular stupidity. Blinded by his absolute rage and his inherent severe class prejudice, Bradley assumed I had simply taken Jada back to my modest suburban home. He still firmly believed I was just a powerless old man who had gotten incredibly lucky with a cheap local bail bondsman. He wanted to terrify us into submission. He wanted to break my spirit violently and force Jada to turn herself back into the federal authorities before she could talk to a real lawyer. He made a quick, untraceable phone call to a local violent street enforcer he had previously used for illegal corporate intimidation. 30 minutes later, a dark, unmarked van screeched to a halt in front of my empty, unassuming suburban house. 4 heavy-set men wearing dark ski masks and wielding solid metal baseball bats piled out of the vehicle. They kicked the front door entirely off its hinges and stormed inside. They systematically and brutally destroyed everything in their path. They shattered the front windows, smashed the old television, ripped the upholstery off the living room furniture, and tore my framed family photographs from the walls. They were sending a loud, violent message from a coward who was too afraid to deliver it himself. I was not at the suburban house to receive his pathetic message. I was sitting comfortably behind the massive, polished mahogany desk in my private oak-paneled chambers at the United States Federal Courthouse. The official, imposing seal of the federal justice system loomed prominently on the wall behind me, a silent testament to the absolute power I quietly wielded. My black judicial robes hung neatly on a heavy brass coat rack in the corner. On the large dual monitors resting on my desk, I was watching a crisp, live, high-definition video feed from the hidden security cameras I had strategically installed throughout my old property weeks ago. I watched with total, clinical detachment as the masked thugs violently reduced my modest furniture to splintered wood and torn fabric. They truly thought they were intimidating a defenseless, uneducated old laborer. They had absolutely no idea they were actively committing a violent felony against a highly protected government official on federal property. I zoomed in on the exterior camera angle, capturing the license plate of their getaway van perfectly, reading the distinct numbers through the high-resolution night vision lens. Bradley was throwing a pathetic, violent tantrum because his pristine criminal world was finally collapsing around his tailored suits. I picked up the secure encrypted phone on my desk and hit the direct speed dial for Kenneth Alvarez. He answered immediately on the first ring. "Kenneth," I said, my voice dropping to a low, highly dangerous timbre. "Bradley just sent a team of hired thugs to violently vandalize my suburban residence to intimidate a witness. I have the entire criminal act recorded in crystal clear, high-definition video. Add a new federal charge to his sealed secret indictment right now. Charge him with conspiracy to commit violence and terrorizing a senior federal official. Let us make sure he never sees the sun again. The walls of Bradley Kensington's pristine corporate world were rapidly caving in. Word of the disastrous raid on his suburban target had reached him much faster than he anticipated. His hired thugs had completely failed to find Jada, and they had unknowingly assaulted a federally protected property. Bradley paced the length of his master bedroom, throwing designer suits and luxury watches into a leather duffel bag. Chloe, his chief accountant and willing accomplice, was frantically stuffing stacks of emergency physical currency and encrypted hard drives into her own expensive luggage. The federal investigators were actively tearing apart their corporate headquarters, and it was only a matter of hours before they realized Jada was not the mastermind holding the strings. "We have to leave right now," Bradley barked, zipping his bag with trembling hands. "The local authorities are useless, but the FBI will not stop until they have a body in custody. I have a chartered Gulfstream, fueled and waiting at the private terminal. We are flying straight to Dubai. The United Arab Emirates will offer us the perfect financial sanctuary, and they will never extradite us for a white-collar corporate dispute." Chloe nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and greedy anticipation. They rushed out of the mansion, leaving behind the opulent life they had built on lies and deceit, speeding toward the airfield under the cover of darkness. 45 minutes later, the heavy cabin door of a sleek private Gulfstream jet sealed shut, locking out the chaotic and collapsing world they had left behind. As the twin engines roared to life and the aircraft smoothly lifted off the tarmac, climbing steeply into the night sky, the lingering tension in Bradley's shoulders finally began to evaporate. He collapsed into a plush, white leather recliner, letting out a loud, triumphant sigh of absolute relief. They had done it. They had successfully escaped the invisible net closing around them. Chloe walked over from the mahogany wet bar, holding 2 crystal flutes filled to the brim with vintage champagne. She handed one to Bradley and sank into the seat across from him, crossing her legs with a wicked, satisfied smile. "To the perfect getaway," she toasted, tapping her glass against his. Bradley took a long, celebratory sip, the expensive bubbles washing away his previous panic. "To the perfect crime," he corrected her, a sinister smirk spreading across his handsome face. "I cannot believe how flawlessly easy it was to completely dismantle that pathetic family. Jada is probably sitting in a dark safe house, crying her eyes out, completely paralyzed by fear. And her father, that miserable, uneducated old servant, is likely begging some incompetent public defender to take her case for free. Can you imagine the look on his face when he realizes his daughter is going to spend the best years of her life rotting in a federal prison? He thought he was so tough standing in the visitation room. He is nothing but a poor, clueless laborer who was stupid enough to hand me the keys to a $50 million empire." Chloe laughed, a cold, hollow sound that filled the luxurious cabin. "He practically gift-wrapped the offshore transfer for us," she mocked. "They are completely powerless, Bradley. We won. We have the money, the freedom, and an entire lifetime to spend it under the desert sun." Bradley leaned back, closing his eyes and basking in his own manufactured glory, completely convinced that he was the smartest and most untouchable man on the planet. Hundreds of miles below them, I remained seated behind my massive mahogany desk, inside my silent federal chambers. The green indicator light on my secure encrypted phone blinked steadily in the dim room. Kenneth Alvarez was on the other end of the line, his voice thrumming with the high-octane energy of a seasoned prosecutor closing in on his prey. "Everett, we have a confirmed visual on the target," Kenneth reported, the rapid clicking of a computer keyboard echoing in the background. "Bradley and his chief accountant just boarded a private charter flight at the executive airstrip on the outskirts of the city. The aircraft is currently airborne and ascending rapidly. Flight control logs show they have filed an international flight plan with a final destination of Dubai. They are making a desperate run for the border. Shall I contact the federal authorities right now? I can easily have the FBI dispatch an interception team or scramble the highway patrol to block the runway before they clear national airspace. We can have them in handcuffs within the next 10 minutes. I stared at the grand seal of the United States Justice Department hanging proudly on my office wall. I slowly dragged my thumb across my jawline, calculating the precise emotional impact of my next judicial maneuver. "No, Kenneth," I replied, my voice absolutely calm and chillingly even. "Do not call the local police and call off the federal agents on the ground. Let them fly. I heard a brief moment of confused silence on the other end of the line. If they cross into international airspace, recovering them will become a logistical nightmare, Kenneth warned, his professional instincts kicking in. I am completely aware of the jurisdictional boundaries, Kenneth, I assured him. But arresting Bradley on the tarmac is entirely too mundane. It gives him the immediate opportunity to play the victim, to call a lawyer, and to hide behind his wealth on American soil. I want him to look out the window of that luxurious cabin and truly believe he has defeated us. I want him to taste the sweet, intoxicating nectar of absolute freedom. And then I want to rip it violently right out of his hands while he is trapped 30,000 feet in the air. I disconnected the call with Kenneth and immediately dialed a highly restricted, unlisted government number. I was bypassing the standard law enforcement channels entirely and reaching straight to the very top of the Federal Aviation hierarchy. The phone rang only twice before the director of the Federal Aviation Administration answered directly. "Director, this is Senior Federal Judge Everett Sinclair," I announced, projecting the full, unrelenting weight of my judicial authority into the receiver. "I have a critical and highly classified situation regarding an airborne private vessel currently attempting to exit United States airspace. I transmitted the specific tail number of Bradley's Gulfstream jet over the secure connection. The primary passenger on that flight is actively fleeing a massive federal indictment involving transnational money laundering and grand larceny. I am officially invoking an emergency judicial mandate under the National Security and Financial Crimes Act. You are to immediately revoke their international flight clearance. You will contact the air traffic control tower monitoring their sector and order the pilot to reverse his heading instantly. Instruct the pilot that if he fails to comply and attempts to cross the maritime border, his aircraft will be officially classified as a hostile fleeing vessel and intercepted by armed military fighter jets. Force that plane back to American soil right now." The director did not hesitate or ask for a single clarification. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied briskly. "The order is being executed as we speak." High above the clouds, Bradley was pouring himself a second glass of vintage champagne when the private jet violently banked to the left. The sudden aggressive change in trajectory sent his crystal glass crashing to the floor. "What is going on?" he shouted, bracing himself against the leather seat. Before the pilot could even announce the mandatory emergency turnaround over the cabin intercom, Bradley's encrypted satellite phone vibrated sharply on the table. He snatched it up. The glowing screen displayed an automated alert from his impenetrable Cayman Islands bank. Account balance, 0. Assets permanently seized by order of the United States Federal High Court. The Gulfstream touched down with a violent jolt on the private runway, the reverse thrusters screaming as the aircraft was forced to a premature halt. Through the secure encrypted channels I monitored from my federal chambers, I listened to the satisfying report from the ground interception team. Outside the small oval window of Bradley's jet, the flashing red and blue lights of waiting federal vehicles painted the tarmac in a chaotic strobe. Bradley Kensington stumbled down the aircraft stairs, his arrogant swagger entirely, completely gone. He was met not by a luxury town car, but by a heavy wall of armed federal agents and customs officials I had personally directed. They did not immediately arrest him, which confused his panicked mind, but they moved with swift bureaucratic efficiency. An agent stepped forward and demanded his passport, as well as Chloe's. Bradley tried to argue, his voice cracking as he threatened them with his high-priced corporate lawyers. But the agents remained completely silent. They confiscated their travel documents, effectively trapping them on American soil. He stood on the cold concrete, clutching his designer duffel bag, the crushing reality of his situation sinking in. His offshore accounts were zeroed out. His international escape route was severed. The $50 million he thought he had successfully stolen had vanished into thin air. He was completely broke, grounded, and entirely vulnerable. The true terror of Bradley's situation was not just the looming threat of a federal prison sentence. Kenneth and I knew exactly who Bradley was truly afraid of. A Ponzi scheme of that magnitude required massive, continuous influxes of capital, and legitimate banks had stopped lending to him months ago. Bradley had turned to the dark, violent underbelly of the city's financial syndicates to keep his fraudulent empire afloat. These were not corporate executives who filed civil lawsuits. These were ruthless men who settled their debts in dark alleys and empty warehouses. By the time Bradley managed to hail a standard taxi away from the airfield, his burner phone was already blowing up with encrypted messages. The syndicate knew the FBI had raided his offices. They knew his accounts were frozen. The messages were short, brutal, and entirely uncompromising. They demanded their money by sunrise, or they promised to dismantle him, piece by piece. Absolute panic gripped his chest. I knew he would frantically dial Chloe's number, desperate for a lifeline. Before they had fled to the airport, Chloe had secured a highly encrypted external hard drive containing a backup reserve of untraceable cryptocurrency. It was their ultimate fail-safe, a digital vault holding just enough capital to appease the violent syndicate and buy him a few more days of breathing room. He ordered the taxi driver to speed toward Chloe's upscale downtown apartment, his mind racing with desperate calculations. He sprinted through the lobby of her building, bypassing the doorman, and pounded frantically on her heavy wooden door. When she finally opened it, the look of sheer desperation on his face was met with an expression he completely failed to understand. Chloe stood in the doorway, but she did not invite him inside. She looked at him not with the shared panic of a co-conspirator, but with the cold, calculating detachment of a survivor who had just secured her own lifeboat. "Give me the drive," Bradley demanded, pushing his way past her into the apartment. "The underground lenders are demanding their money right now. We have to access the crypto reserves, or I am a dead man." He tore through her living room, frantically tearing open drawers and throwing designer pillows onto the floor. What Bradley did not know was that Kenneth and I had already anticipated this exact vulnerability. Chloe crossed her arms, watching his pathetic meltdown with an icy smirk. "You are wasting your time, Bradley," she stated, her voice remarkably steady. "The drive is not here." Bradley froze, turning to her with a look of utter confusion. "What do you mean it is not here? Where is it?" She took a step back, maintaining a safe distance from his erratic energy. "About an hour after we got dragged off that tarmac, I received a very interesting phone call from a man named Kenneth Alvarez," she explained smoothly. "He made me an offer I simply could not refuse. Absolute total immunity from all federal prosecution in exchange for full cooperation and the physical surrender of all your hidden digital assets." Bradley's face drained of all color as her words struck him like physical blows. "You gave him the drive," he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. "You sold me out." "I am an accountant, Bradley," she replied coldly. "I look at the numbers, and I calculate the best possible outcome. You are finished. The federal government has you cornered, and the syndicate wants your head on a spike. There is zero return on investment for staying loyal to a sinking ship. I handed the encrypted drive directly to Kenneth 30 minutes ago." She walked over and opened her front door wide, gesturing for him to leave. "Get out of my apartment before I call the police." The absolute betrayal shattered the very last remnant of Bradley's arrogant facade. He stumbled out of Chloe's apartment complex, a completely broken man. He had no passport, no digital currency, no offshore accounts, and a violent criminal syndicate actively hunting him down. Kenneth called me to confirm that the cryptocurrency drive was safely secured in our possession. His only remaining option was to scavenge the physical assets he had hoarded in his marital home. The mansion was filled with million-dollar art pieces, solid gold watches, and high-end jewelry he could easily pawn on the black market to secure enough cash to disappear into the underground. He hailed another taxi, promising the driver triple the fare to speed toward the exclusive gated community where the sprawling estate was located. He practically threw himself out of the moving vehicle as it pulled into the long, manicured driveway. His tailored suit was now completely wrinkled and soaked in a cold, terrified sweat. He ran up the wide stone steps toward the grand double doors of the mansion, his mind frantically prioritizing which expensive items he could stuff into his duffel bag the fastest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy brass keychain, his hands shaking violently as he approached the grand entrance. He jammed his key into the heavy deadbolt, but it refused to turn. He pulled it out and shoved it back in, twisting frantically, but the internal mechanism had been entirely replaced. The lock was completely new. As he stepped back in sheer frustration, his eyes caught a crisp white legal document securely taped to the center of the heavy custom wooden door. He leaned in, his breath catching in his throat as he read the bold black lettering printed across the top. "Premises seized. legal owner of record, the Corinne Sinclair Trust. He was officially locked out on the street. Standing on the street with the heavy wooden door locked against him, Bradley realized he had absolutely nothing left to lose. The violent syndicate hunting him down would not accept apologies or promises. They wanted their money, and they would extract it from him in blood. Driven completely mad by being cornered, his mind turned to his very last, deeply sinister financial asset. Shortly after their wedding, he had manipulated Jada into signing a massive, comprehensive life insurance policy. It guaranteed a $10 million payout directly to him in the event of her tragic demise, completely bypassing the frozen blind trust. Stripped of his pristine Wall Street image and running entirely on desperate, predatory adrenaline, Bradley ventured into a gritty industrial sector of the city. He traded his solid gold Rolex, the absolute last physical asset he possessed on his wrist, to an illegal arms dealer operating out of a dimly lit alleyway. In exchange, he received an untraceable, fully suppressed 9mm handgun and a single loaded magazine. The cold, heavy weight of the weapon in his hands transformed his frantic panic into a dark, hyper-focused killer instinct. He had crossed the threshold from white-collar fraud into absolute, unhinged madness. He knew he could not just wander the city streets searching for a woman hidden by a federal judge. He needed precise, undeniable coordinates. Using the very last crumpled $100 bills from his wallet, he met with a shady underworld hacker he had previously utilized to erase digital corporate footprints. He handed over Jada's phone number and private account details, demanding an immediate location. The hacker worked rapidly, his fingers flying across the keyboard, eventually triangulating the cellular signal to a specific, isolated suburban apartment on the far, quiet edge of the city limits. It was an unassuming, low-rent neighborhood. To Bradley, it was exactly the kind of pathetic, dilapidated place an old, uneducated laborer like Everett would attempt to hide his terrified daughter. Bradley memorized the address, stole an older, inconspicuous sedan from a nearby commuter parking lot, and drove through the dead of night. His mind replayed the exact sequence of events he was about to execute. He would break in quietly, silence his wife, stage the bloody scene as a tragic home invasion gone terribly wrong, and walk away a wealthy, grieving widower, free from the syndicate's wrath. The suburban streets grew darker and more isolated as he finally approached the target destination. He parked 2 blocks away, pulling a dark knit cap over his head to conceal his identity. The crisp, freezing night air bit at his skin as he crept through the deep shadows of the manicured lawns. He located the property, a single-story structure shrouded in complete darkness. Moving with silent, practiced precision, he bypassed the driveway, used a glass cutter on the rear patio door, popped the lock, and stepped smoothly into the pitch-black living room. Bradley truly believed he was a phantom, slipping undetected into enemy territory. He was utterly unaware that every single breath he took, every cautious step he made across the carpet, was being closely monitored. Kenneth and I had mapped out his psychological profile with clinical, unforgiving precision days ago. We knew with absolute certainty that once the offshore funds vanished and the criminal syndicate started breathing down his neck, he would violently pivot to the life insurance policy. He was entirely predictable in his greed. The quiet suburban house he was currently prowling through was not a safe house at all. It was a highly sophisticated, federal-grade trap I had personally authorized and prepared. Jada was miles away, sleeping soundly behind the impenetrable security of my downtown penthouse. The phone signal the underworld hacker had traced was merely a clone device we had deliberately planted on the nightstand of this vacant, staged property. From my secure monitoring room at the federal courthouse, Kenneth and I sat in total darkness, illuminated only by the glow of a massive bank of high-definition monitors. The entire bait house was rigged with hidden military-grade infrared cameras and state-of-the-art motion sensors. We watched the glowing thermal silhouette of Bradley moving slowly down the narrow hallway, the suppressed handgun raised tightly in front of him. His murderous movements were being recorded from 6 different angles, streaming directly onto heavily encrypted federal servers. This was no longer just a complex financial fraud case. Bradley Kensington was actively committing premeditated attempted murder on a live federal feed. We had let the desperate rat wander willingly into the deepest, darkest part of the maze, and the heavy steel door was already permanently locked behind him. Bradley paused outside the master bedroom. The wooden door was slightly ajar, He pushed it open with the cold barrel of his gun, his eyes adjusting to the heavy, suffocating gloom of the room. In the exact center of the space, illuminated only by the faint, ghostly moonlight filtering through the closed blinds, was a large bed. Underneath the heavy winter quilt lay the unmistakable, bulky shape of a human body, curled on its side, breathing in a slow, rhythmic pattern. The clone cell phone rested on the nightstand right next to the bed, softly glowing with a simulated charging light. Bradley gripped the weapon with both hands, his face twisting into an ugly, terrifying mask of raw desperation and ruthless, unadulterated greed. He did not hesitate for a single second. He did not offer a final word of apology or experience even a brief moment of moral hesitation. He simply stepped forward, aimed the suppressed pistol directly at the center of the blanketed mass, and pulled the trigger. The gun coughed a muffled, deadly sound. 2 hollow-point bullets tore violently through the thick fabric, striking their intended target dead center. Instead of a painful scream, a massive burst of synthetic white feathers erupted violently into the air. Underneath the heavy blanket were nothing but tightly rolled pillows and a mechanical breathing simulator. Before Bradley could even process his catastrophic, life-ending mistake, the entire bedroom erupted in blinding, stadium-grade floodlights. The mechanical whine of a police megaphone pierced the sudden silence. The heavy glass of the bedroom windows shattered violently inward. A dozen heavily armored federal SWAT operatives poured into the room from every direction, red laser sights painting Bradley's chest. A heavy tactical shield slammed brutally into his back, pinning him face down against the hardwood floor. The cold, sterile walls of the federal interrogation room should have broken him completely. Any normal man caught red-handed by a federal tactical team firing a suppressed weapon into a bed he fully believed held his sleeping wife would be weeping uncontrollably and begging for mercy. But Bradley Kensington was not a normal man. He was a creature born entirely of Wall Street entitlement and supreme narcissism. Sitting across from 2 hardened federal interrogators, he did not shed a single tear or show a microscopic ounce of remorse. The lead agent aggressively threw glossy crime scene photographs onto the metal table, showing the bullet holes in the pillows and the shattered glass of the patio door. Bradley did not even blink. He did not utter a single word of apology or offer a pathetic excuse. Instead, he leaned back in his uncomfortable metal chair, heavily shackled to the heavy table, and offered the federal agents a smug, highly condescending smirk. His expensive designer suit was torn and severely stained with the dirt from the floor where the tactical team had pinned him, but his sheer arrogance remained entirely intact. He knew the golden unwritten rule of high-stakes white-collar crime. You never speak to the authorities without your attorney present. He stared at the two-way mirror with absolute unbroken confidence. He genuinely believed that the standard laws of the working class simply did not apply to a man of his stature. He was a master of the universe, who was only temporarily inconvenienced by a minor physical misunderstanding. He just needed to deploy the right leverage to buy his way out of this concrete box. What the federal agents completely failed to realize was that a financial predator like Bradley never operates without a final, absolute contingency plan hidden deep in the shadows. When his offshore Cayman accounts were permanently frozen by my judicial order, he had lost his primary digital liquidity, but he had not lost everything. During a brief, legally permitted phone call from the holding facility, he reached out to a shadow broker he kept on permanent secret retainer. Bradley authorized the immediate release of a heavily guarded safety deposit box, located in a private underground vault completely outside of federal jurisdiction. Inside that dark steel box lay $10 million in flawless, untraceable conflict diamonds. This immense physical wealth was immediately transferred directly into the vast retainer account of Arthur Sterling. Arthur was not just a typical defense attorney. He was an apex predator in the modern legal world, widely known as the most ruthless, aggressive, and brutally expensive legal mind in the United States. He specialized exclusively in defending the absolute indefensible. Corrupt billionaires, compromised politicians, and violent cartel bosses walked free because Arthur Sterling knew exactly how to butcher the American justice system and manipulate the fundamental truth. The exact moment the diamonds cleared, Arthur went to work deploying a masterclass in aggressive total legal warfare. He did not start his battle in the quiet courtroom. He started it in the loud, chaotic court of public opinion. Within 24 hours, highly coordinated and incredibly vicious hit pieces began appearing across major television news networks and influential financial blogs. The entire factual narrative was flipped completely upside down. The articles painted a deeply sympathetic picture of a brilliant, vulnerable fund manager who had been severely compromised by acute mental exhaustion. They completely ignored the undeniable, terrifying fact that he had actively attempted to murder his wife in cold blood. Instead, his highly paid media operatives focused entirely on his sudden financial ruin, suggesting he was suffering from a temporary, devastating psychotic break triggered by unprecedented and highly suspicious market pressure. Arthur mobilized elite public relations firms to flood the internet with carefully curated older images of Bradley, engaging in philanthropic charity work, deliberately attempting to overshadow the harsh reality of his violent federal crimes. I sat quietly in my private judicial chambers, reviewing the sudden massive onslaught of media propaganda appearing on my secondary monitors. Kenneth Alvarez sat directly across from my heavy mahogany desk, his face tight with visible, blistering fury. As a former aggressive federal prosecutor, Kenneth absolutely despised men exactly like Arthur Sterling. Arthur made a highly lucrative career out of deeply perverting the very justice system we had sworn our lives to uphold. Ken slapped a thick, heavy legal file onto my desk with a loud, sharp crack. He is already filing emergency injunctions against our core evidence. Kenneth growled, pacing the length of the room with heavy, aggressive steps. He is officially claiming the suburban house raid was an illegal, unconstitutional entrapment operation conducted without proper judicial oversight. He is demanding the immediate and total suppression of the infrared video footage showing Bradley firing the weapon. He claims it violates his client's civil rights. We need to strike back publicly, right now, before he controls the entire narrative and poisons the future jury pool. I picked up Arthur Sterling's extensive legal dossier and flipped through the dense pages with supreme clinical detachment. I had encountered loud, arrogant lawyers exactly like him dozens of times throughout my 4 decades on the federal bench. They rely entirely on creating noise, manufacturing distraction, and deploying aggressive intimidation tactics to force prosecutors into making fatal, emotional mistakes. I looked up at Kenneth, my expression entirely unreadable and completely devoid of any anger. "Do absolutely nothing, Kenneth," I ordered, my voice incredibly calm and completely flat. "Do not issue a single press release. Do not file any angry counter-injunctions today. Let Arthur Sterling make all the loud noise he desperately wants to make. Let him spend those hidden diamonds fighting a useless media war." Kenneth stopped pacing, looking at me with deep, utter confusion. "But he is actively destroying Jada's reputation out there, Everett. He is turning the public against a completely innocent victim. If you want to catch a highly dangerous, unpredictable animal, you do not shout and wave your arms aggressively," I explained, leaning forward, resting my hands on the desk. "You stay perfectly still, and you let them walk confidently and arrogantly into the exact center of the trap." Arthur heavily relies on a hostile emotional reaction to validate his aggressive defense strategy. By remaining entirely silent and utterly indifferent, we completely deprive him of his primary psychological weapon. Let the enemy dig his own massive grave. When the time is exactly right, we will simply push him in and bury him. Emboldened by our absolute strategic silence, Arthur Sterling accelerated his vicious media campaign to its absolute toxic limit. He organized a massive, highly publicized primetime press conference right on the grand marble steps of the city's main federal courthouse. Hundreds of eager reporters and flashing camera crews gathered tightly to hear his highly anticipated formal statement. Arthur stepped up to the podium, wearing a custom-tailored suit, projecting an aura of grave, righteous indignation. He did not just defend his client against the severe charges. He launched a direct, devastating, and utterly fabricated nuclear strike against my daughter. He aggressively and confidently claimed that Dr. Jada Sinclair was not a tragic victim at all. He painted her to the entire watching nation as a ruthless, highly manipulative sociopath who had intentionally orchestrated the entire $50 million corporate embezzlement scheme from the very beginning. He spun a grotesque, entirely fictional narrative where Jada had emotionally abused and financially blackmailed Bradley, using his deep, profound love for her to force him into signing those fraudulent corporate documents. According to Arthur's venomous lies, Jada had deliberately set him up to take the ultimate fall for her own massive, unprecedented financial crimes. He brazenly claimed the terrifying events at the suburban house were not an assassination attempt, but rather a desperate, misguided cry for help from a deeply broken man pushed completely over the edge of sanity by a calculated narcissistic spouse. He stood proudly before the nation and declared that Bradley Kensington was the true innocent victim of a grand, horrific criminal conspiracy masterminded by his own wife. The true terrifying nightmare materialized the following morning during the official preliminary bail hearing inside the federal courthouse. We fully expected the presiding judge to deny bail immediately and remand him to custody, given the incredibly severe federal charges of premeditated attempted murder and grand larceny. However, Arthur Sterling possessed an insidious influence that extended far into the dark, corrupt corners of the local judicial system. Mass sums of dark money quietly changed hands in the shadows, and powerful political favors were violently called in behind closed doors. To the absolute horror and sheer disbelief of the federal prosecutors, the compromised judge slammed his wooden gavel and officially granted Bradley release on a massive cash bond, claiming he was not a flight risk. Bradley Kensington walked out of the federal courtroom a completely free man, turning back to flash a terrifying, highly arrogant, victorious grin directly at the prosecution table. The immediate aftermath of Bradley walking free on bail was a masterclass in aggressive legal terrorism. Arthur Sterling did not waste a single second celebrating his highly corrupt victory. He immediately filed a relentless barrage of malicious court motions designed to completely paralyze our side and drain our resources. He targeted Jada directly, where he knew it would inflict the maximum amount of psychological damage. Arthur legally subpoenaed all of her confidential patient records from the hospital, claiming he needed them to prove a fabricated pattern of medical negligence and severe mental instability. He then aggressively leaked heavily doctored psychiatric evaluations to the tabloid press, suggesting my daughter suffered from a severe narcissistic personality disorder and a documented history of pathological lying. He completely weaponized the civil legal system to freeze Jada's remaining personal bank accounts, leaving her without a single dime to her name. It was a brutal, scorched earth tactic meant to starve us out, humiliate her publicly, and force a desperate, unconditional settlement. Inside the highly secure walls of my downtown penthouse, the psychological toll of Arthur's vicious media campaign was becoming unbearably heavy. Jada sat on the edge of the plush leather sofa, staring blankly at the large television screen. The national daytime talk shows were broadcasting a live, exclusive interview with Bradley. He was wearing a soft gray sweater, perfectly styled to look exhausted and deeply vulnerable. He expertly squeezed out manufactured tears as he lied to a sympathetic television host, claiming he was the true victim of severe emotional and financial abuse. He painted himself as a devoted, loving husband who had been cruelly manipulated and framed by a brilliant but fundamentally sociopathic surgeon. As the broadcast concluded, Jada's cell phone rang with a devastating professional update. The state medical board had officially convened an emergency disciplinary hearing. Due to the incredibly severe federal allegations and the relentless negative media circus, they were indefinitely suspending her medical license and permanently removing her from the hospital surgical schedule. Jada dropped her phone onto the glass coffee table, her resilient spirit visibly fracturing under the coordinated assault. She looked up at me with eyes full of sheer, overwhelming defeat. "They are taking absolutely everything, Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense, suffocating pressure. "I dedicated my entire life to saving children, and now the whole world thinks I am a greedy monster. Arthur Sterling owns the media narrative, and he clearly owns the local judges. We cannot fight this kind of corrupted, untouchable power. We are going to lose everything." I walked over and placed a firm, highly reassuring hand on her trembling shoulder. "The wheels of absolute justice turn slowly, Jada," I said, my voice a low, comforting rumble of absolute certainty. "But they grind exceedingly fine." I left her to rest and retreated to my secure home office, locking the heavy mahogany door firmly behind me. Arthur Sterling genuinely believed he was completely untouchable because he operated exclusively in the dark, murky waters of judicial corruption and public manipulation. He did not realize he was swimming arrogantly in an ocean that I effectively owned. I opened a highly classified, secure federal database, accessible only to senior federal judges, holding the absolute highest security clearances. I completely bypassed the standard public legal records and dug directly into the encrypted digital shadows of Arthur's vast legal empire. I ordered Kenneth Alvarez to immediately deploy a specialized team of forensic federal auditors to trace the exact origin of the sudden, massive cash influx into Arthur's offshore retainer accounts. Within a matter of hours, we uncovered the distinct, undeniable digital footprint of the conflict diamonds Bradley had used to literally buy his freedom. But I did not stop my investigation there. I meticulously scrutinized the private banking records of the corrupt preliminary judge who had miraculously granted Bradley bail against all standard federal guidelines. I rapidly uncovered a highly complex web of anonymous shell companies transferring massive sums of untraceable digital currency directly into the judge's hidden offshore family trust, exactly 12 hours before the bail hearing took place. Finally, I investigated the specific doctor who had signed Arthur's fabricated psychiatric evaluation of Jada. He was a disgraced former medical practitioner, actively drowning in massive malpractice debts. Arthur had essentially purchased a licensed medical professional to commit federal perjury on a highly public scale. Armed with an impenetrable arsenal of undeniable federal evidence, I did not run to the media to complain or file angry public motions. I struck silently and lethally at the very foundation of their criminal conspiracy. I instructed Kenneth to completely bypass the local corrupt judicial circuit entirely. Instead, he filed a highly classified ex-parte motion directly with the Supreme Federal Judicial Oversight Committee in Washington. We handed the committee the exact banking routing numbers, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that the preliminary judge had accepted a massive financial bribe from Arthur Sterling. Then Kenneth paid a personal late-night visit to the disgraced psychiatrist who had falsified Jada's mental health records. Kenneth quietly cornered the terrified doctor in his private suburban driveway, sliding a thick, heavy file of undeniable federal evidence across the hood of his luxury car. Kenneth offered the corrupt doctor a singular, unyielding choice. He could either become a highly confidential federal informant and testify fully against Arthur Sterling on the record, or he could face 20 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for medical fraud and conspiracy to commit federal perjury. The cowardly doctor broke instantly under the immense pressure, signing a full sworn confession right there in the dark street, under the dim glow of a streetlight. The very next morning, Arthur Sterling was sitting comfortably behind his massive glass desk in his lavish corner office, pouring Bradley a celebratory glass of expensive scotch. They were laughing loudly, toasting to the utter public destruction of my daughter's pristine medical career. Their arrogant, obnoxious laughter was suddenly and violently interrupted when Arthur's senior paralegal burst into the executive office. She was completely pale and shaking violently from head to toe. She dropped a massive stack of heavy official federal documents directly onto his pristine glass desk. The State Bar Association had just issued an emergency total suspension of Arthur's legal license, pending a massive immediate federal raid regarding judicial bribery and severe witness tampering. The heavy federal raid on Arthur Sterling's pristine corporate office should have completely paralyzed Bradley Kensington's defense strategy. Federal agents violently seized encrypted servers, boxed up decades of corrupt legal files, and officially stripped Arthur of his lucrative license to practice law. But apex predators do not simply roll over and surrender when they are wounded. Operating from the dark, highly secure shadows of his sprawling private mansion, Arthur immediately transferred Bradley's active case file to his senior managing partner, Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a highly polished, aggressive corporate shark who acted as Arthur's pristine public mouthpiece, while Arthur continued to pull the malicious puppet strings from behind closed doors. They knew the federal bribery charges against Arthur would take many months to prosecute, but Bradley's very survival required immediate, brutal action. Arthur quickly and correctly deduced that the only possible way the federal prosecutors had obtained the highly encrypted offshore routing numbers was through a highly placed corporate insider. They immediately targeted Chloe, the chief accountant, who had originally traded the digital drive for federal immunity. Arthur aggressively reached out to his violent underground syndicate connections, leveraging his remaining hidden diamond assets to place a massive, multi-million-dollar bounty on her head. He needed her permanently silenced before she could officially authenticate the digital evidence before a federal grand jury. The devastating impact of Arthur's shadow maneuver hit us like a runaway freight train less than 48 hours later. Kenneth Alvarez arrived at my downtown penthouse, looking more exhausted and grim than I had ever seen him during our long careers together. He dropped his heavy leather briefcase onto the floor and delivered the catastrophic news. Chloe had completely vanished, without a single trace. She had missed her mandatory morning check-in with her federal handlers. Her highly secure apartment was found completely empty, with terrifying signs of a violent struggle, and her emergency burner phone was permanently deactivated. Without her direct sworn testimony to legally authenticate the encrypted hard drive, the entire mountain of digital evidence proving Bradley had forged Jada's signatures would be fiercely contested and likely dismissed entirely. Marcus Thorne was already preparing a massive legal motion to have the drive entirely thrown out of court as inadmissible and unverified hearsay. Jada sat on the edge of the plush sofa, her hands covering her face as the heavy, crushing weight of absolute despair returned to suffocate her. The relentless national media cycle was still heavily skewed against her, painting her as a manipulative fugitive hiding from true justice. Now, the singular crucial witness who could definitively prove her absolute innocence was missing and presumed dead. Bradley capitalized on this sudden massive advantage immediately. He appeared on a highly popular syndicated true crime podcast, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and a deeply somber expression. He softly implied to the millions of captive listeners that the federal case against him was rapidly falling apart, because the prosecution's supposed star witness had fled the country out of sheer guilt. He was successfully winning the brutal war of public perception and systematically dismantling our legal foundation, piece by piece. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, looking out over the sprawling city skyline as the sunset cast long, dark shadows over the buildings. The sheer terror radiating from my daughter would have driven any normal father to desperate and highly reckless action. But I was not a normal father. I was a man who had spent 4 decades navigating the absolute darkest, most violent labyrinths of the American criminal justice system. I knew exactly how these underground syndicates operated. They rarely eliminated a high-value target immediately. They preferred to extract every possible piece of leverage, financial codes, and private information before staging a tragic, highly believable accident. I returned to my secure, encrypted workstation and bypassed the standard federal investigative channels entirely. I directly contacted a highly classified division of the United States Marshals Service, an elite covert tracking unit I had personally authorized and protected during a massive racketeering trial a decade ago. I provided them with the highly specific digital footprint of the burner phone Bradley had used to contact his underground syndicate lenders days prior. We aggressively cross-referenced the cellular data with the city's automated license plate reader network, specifically searching for the dark, unmarked vans typically utilized by local enforcers. It took 6 agonizing hours of silent, relentless digital hunting, but the tracking unit finally secured a massive breakthrough. The data pinpointed a highly isolated, abandoned shipping warehouse situated on the gritty, decaying industrial waterfront. Thermal imaging from a high-altitude federal surveillance drone confirmed the presence of 4 heavily armed individuals and 1 restrained captive inside the freezing, dilapidated structure. I did not dispatch the local police department, who could easily tip off Arthur's extensive network of corrupt street-level informants. Instead, I authorized the immediate deployment of the FBI hostage rescue team, a Tier 1 tactical unit specializing in flawless, high-risk extractions. In the dead of night, operating with absolute total silence, the heavily armored tactical operators infiltrated the abandoned warehouse. They breached the facility with surgical military precision, utilizing suppressed weapons and flashbang grenades, entirely neutralizing the 4 armed syndicate enforcers before a single lethal shot could be fired. They found Chloe, violently bound to a metal chair, terrified, severely bruised, but fundamentally alive and willing to cooperate. She was immediately extracted from the hostile environment and transported directly via heavily armored convoy to an impenetrable maximum security underground federal bunker. I ensured she was officially enrolled in the highest heavily classified tier of the Federal Witness Protection Program, making her completely invisible to Arthur Sterling and his violent associates. She was given round-the-clock protection and a team of federal medics to ensure she was perfectly ready to take the stand. The very next morning, completely oblivious to the spectacular absolute failure of his underground hit squad, Marcus Thorne walked into the federal courthouse with supreme, unearned confidence. He approached the pretrial evidentiary hearing, wearing a triumphant, arrogant smirk, fully prepared to dismantle our entire prosecution and walk his client out the front door. Inside the crowded federal courtroom, Marcus Thorne aggressively addressed the presiding judge, formally moving to completely strike the encrypted hard drive from the official record due to the permanent, sudden absence of the authenticating witness. He arrogantly declared that the prosecution's entire case was built on fabricated, unreliable ghosts. Kenneth Alvarez sat at the prosecution table, completely relaxed, and simply smiled a cold, predatory smile. He politely requested the judge direct his attention to the rear of the courtroom. The heavy wooden double doors swung open dramatically. Chloe stepped confidently into the room, flanked tightly by 4 heavily armed United States Marshals. Bradley Kensington's triumphant smirk instantly melted into an expression of sheer, absolute terror. The sudden arrival of Chloe, flanked by heavily armed United States Marshals, sent a massive, devastating shockwave through the federal courtroom. Marcus Thorne froze completely, his mouth hanging open in mid-sentence as his entire aggressive legal strategy instantly vaporized into thin air. Bradley Kensington gripped the edge of the heavy wooden defense table so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white, his arrogant facade crumbling into sheer, unadulterated panic. The presiding judge immediately slammed his wooden gavel, restoring absolute order to the chaotic room. With the authenticating witness physically present and safely secured under maximum federal protection, the judge officially ruled the highly encrypted hard drive completely admissible as primary prosecution evidence. The massive mountain of digital data, proving Bradley had deliberately forged Jada's signatures to execute his $50 million embezzlement scheme, was now permanently cemented into the federal record. Bradley sank heavily into his leather chair, shooting a deeply terrified look at Marcus. They both knew the violent underground syndicate hit squad they had hired to permanently silence Chloe had spectacularly failed. The formidable walls of their corrupt legal fortress were beginning to crack under the immense, unrelenting pressure of absolute justice. But a wounded predator is always at its most dangerous when backed completely into a corner. Operating entirely from his heavily fortified mansion, the disgraced mastermind Arthur Sterling instructed Marcus to pivot immediately to a new, brutally vicious tactic. If they could not defeat the federal criminal charges directly, they would absolutely obliterate Jada in the civil courts. Arthur aggressively weaponized his extensive dark money network to secretly fund a massive class action lawsuit against my daughter. They meticulously tracked down several families of Jada's former pediatric patients and offered them exorbitant amounts of untraceable cash to file horrific, fabricated claims of severe medical malpractice. They viciously alleged that Jada was so deeply distracted by managing her massive criminal enterprise that she exhibited severe surgical negligence, resulting in long-term harm to innocent children. Marcus held a highly aggressive press conference outside the courthouse, confidently declaring that Jada was not only a ruthless financial criminal, but a profound danger to the innocent patients she was sworn to protect. Bradley stood right behind his lawyer, projecting a smug, deeply insulting look of manufactured sorrow. He gave an exclusive primetime television interview later that evening, perfectly playing the role of the horrified wealthy husband. I grew up in a world of profound financial privilege and immense corporate responsibility, Bradley lied smoothly, directly to the camera. We are specifically taught to protect the vulnerable. Discovering that my own wife was secretly funding her illegal offshore activities at the direct expense of innocent sick children is a nightmare I can barely comprehend. I will spend every dime I have left to ensure those poor families receive the ultimate compensation they deserve. He was aggressively twisting the knife, utilizing his polished, elite upbringing to manipulate the public into viewing him as a righteous savior, while actively destroying my daughter's fundamental professional purpose in life. Inside my highly secure downtown penthouse, the brutal psychological impact of the fabricated malpractice lawsuits hit Jada much harder than any previous attack. She had maintained incredible resilience through the false criminal charges and the terrifying national media smear campaign, but actively attacking her pristine surgical record struck directly at her very soul. She wept bitterly on the leather sofa, completely shattered by the vile public accusation that she would ever intentionally harm a child on the operating table. I watched her immense pain with a cold, highly calculating stillness. My internal rage was absolute, but a senior federal judge never acts on raw, uncontrolled emotion. I carefully reviewed the sprawling civil filings, systematically examining the specific local law firm Arthur had hired to coordinate the malicious class action suit. The firm was a notorious high-volume operation, specializing in frivolous, aggressive litigation and out-of-court settlements. I leaned over my encrypted workstation, mapping out their aggressive financial structure with surgical precision. Arthur was funneling the illicit bribe money to the fake plaintiffs through a highly complex network of supposed charitable medical foundations. He genuinely believed his dark money trail was completely untraceable, securely protected by dense layers of attorney-client privilege and anonymous corporate donations. He was fatally mistaken. I understood the specific bureaucratic mechanics of these fraudulent charitable trusts far better than the very corrupt lawyers who drafted them. I systematically identified the specific offshore holding company Arthur was utilizing to completely bypass domestic financial regulations. He had brilliantly disguised the direct cash bribes as generous medical hardship grants to the families, completely blinding the local civil judges to the blatant witness tampering. I saw exactly where to insert the judicial blade to sever the corrupt financial artery, actively feeding his vicious civil attack. I immediately contacted Kenneth Alvarez, deploying him with absolute maximum prejudice against the vulnerable network. We completely bypassed the slow public civil courts and went directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Kenneth presented the elite federal tax investigators with the undeniable encrypted routing numbers, proving the supposedly charitable medical grants were actually massive illegal bribes orchestrated directly by Marcus Thorne and his corrupt civil litigation partners. Within a matter of hours, the IRS executed rapid, simultaneous, unannounced, aggressive audits on every single family participating in the fraudulent class action lawsuit. Faced with the sudden, terrifying reality of massive federal tax evasion charges and severe prison time, the bribed plaintiffs completely folded under the intense government pressure. They confessed immediately on the official federal record that Marcus Thorne had explicitly paid them large sums of cash to fabricate the horrific surgical negligence claims against Dr. Jada Sinclair. The malicious civil lawsuit instantly collapsed before a single official subpoena could even be served, entirely neutralizing their brutal attempt to bankrupt the trust and permanently destroy my daughter's pristine medical legacy. Bradley Kensington was sitting comfortably in his lavish, temporary hotel suite, confidently pouring himself a heavy glass of expensive aged bourbon. He genuinely believed the massive civil lawsuits were successfully crushing Jada's spirit and completely distracting the federal prosecutors from his own immediate criminal vulnerability. His smug, victorious smile vanished instantly when his secure burner phone vibrated aggressively on the glass coffee table. It was an urgent, heavily encrypted message from Marcus Thorne. "We have a massive, catastrophic problem," Bradley, the text message read. "The FBI just finished pulling the highly encrypted cell phone records from the men arrested during the warehouse raid. They know exactly who transferred the funds to hire the hitmen." The expensive glass of bourbon slipped entirely from Bradley Kensington's hand, shattering violently against the hotel suite floor. The encrypted text message from Marcus Thorne glared up at him like a digital death sentence. The FBI had successfully traced the dark money used to hire the warehouse hit squad. Bradley scrambled to call his lawyer, his breath coming in short, rapid gasps. He demanded to know how the federal agents had tracked the untraceable funds. Marcus answered with the absolute frigid calm of a corporate shark who had already anticipated the structural collapse. He instructed Bradley to relax and maintain his composure. Arthur Sterling was a master of digital misdirection, and he had intentionally laid a false trail. Marcus explained that Arthur knew the federal agents would eventually crack the encrypted burner phones. He had deliberately routed the initial wire transfers through a highly complex proxy server network, specifically bouncing the final IP address off the internal secure mainframe of Jada's hospital. Bradley stopped pacing, his heart rate slowly returning to a steady, arrogant rhythm. He realized they had effectively framed Jada for the violent hitmen. Marcus confirmed the brutal strategy, detailing how the Federal Cyber Division was currently tracing the funds directly to her professional medical network. They were legally spinning this to claim she hired the thugs to silence Chloe and protect her own fraudulent empire. By dawn, Marcus Thorne had successfully launched his vicious counteroffensive inside the federal courthouse. He aggressively filed an emergency motion, demanding Jada Sinclair be immediately remanded to maximum security custody for actively orchestrating an assassination attempt against a crucial federal witness. Bradley leaned into the fabricated narrative with the polished ease of a man who had never faced a single genuine consequence in his entire privileged life. Growing up in the ultra-wealthy enclaves of the Hamptons, Bradley had been explicitly taught that the truth was simply a malleable commodity, purchased by the highest bidder. When he was expelled from a prestigious prep school for stealing a massive exam ledger, his wealthy father had simply donated a new science wing and blamed a vulnerable scholarship student. Bradley viewed the destruction of my daughter through the exact same sociopathic lens. She was merely collateral damage, completely necessary to preserve his pristine financial legacy. He released another highly coordinated statement to his captive media network, expressing profound manufactured terror for his own personal safety. He lied smoothly to a primetime anchor, stating it broke his heart to see the woman he loved resort to such horrific violence to conceal her financial crimes. He claimed he feared she would not stop until anyone who knew the truth was permanently silenced. The unrelenting media assault severely compounded Jada's immense trauma. She paced the floors of my downtown penthouse, clutching her arms defensively. She told me they were going to arrest her again, her voice hollow with absolute exhaustion. She recognized they had manipulated the digital trail to make her look like a violent mob boss. She believed no one would ever see her innocence when the computer logs placed the crime directly at her place of healing. I watched the frantic news coverage with an expression of absolute, immovable stone. My daughter was slowly suffocating under the immense weight of their coordinated digital terrorism. But a senior federal judge does not panic in the face of fabricated evidence. I retreated to my secure office and activated my highly encrypted judicial terminal. I meticulously reviewed the technical preliminary reports Marcus Thorne had gleefully submitted to the public docket. A standard local cybercrimes unit would look at the hospital IP address and immediately declare a definitive match, closing the investigation. But I possessed decades of experience dismantling highly sophisticated transnational cyber syndicates. I recognized the distinct digital architecture of the spoofing protocol Arthur Sterling had utilized. It was not a generic dark web proxy used by common criminals. It was a proprietary, heavily encrypted routing sequence utilized exclusively by elite private military contractors and shadow intelligence firms. Arthur had utilized his vast dark money network to hire a highly illegal private intelligence firm to violently manipulate the hospital servers. I systematically cross-referenced the specific routing algorithms with classified federal contractor databases checking the secure digital fingerprints against known mercenary networks. Within 2 hours, I successfully isolated the exact rogue intelligence firm operating out of a heavily guarded corporate park in Northern Virginia. They were a highly lucrative outfit that provided illegal digital erasure services for corrupt politicians and violent international oligarchs. I saw exactly how to completely sever the digital head of their malicious operation. I picked up my secure phone and contacted Kenneth Alvarez, bypassing standard law enforcement entirely. Local field agents would be forced to navigate weeks of dense bureaucratic red tape to secure a warrant against a heavily fortified intelligence firm with political connections. I instructed Kenneth to immediately contact the United States Cyber Command at the National Security Agency. Utilizing my absolute highest-level judicial clearance, I officially authorized a classified domestic counterterrorism warrant under the provisions of the Patriot Act. I formally declared the rogue intelligence firm a direct and immediate threat to federal judicial security. At exactly 3 a.m, a highly specialized team of military cyber operators executed a total silent raid on the Virginia facility. They did not break down doors or fire weapons to announce their presence. They systematically breached the physical network nodes and severed the building from the global internet, causing every computer screen in the complex to instantly go entirely black. The operators physically seized every single primary server blade in the entire compound, loading them into armored transport vehicles. By sunrise, they had completely dismantled the proxy network Arthur Sterling had built to frame my daughter. The pristine, unredacted server logs were completely extracted, proving undeniably that the hospital IP address had been deliberately manipulated. The unencrypted data confirmed the original hitman payment had originated directly from Arthur Sterling's personal offshore holding account, entirely clearing Jada of the horrific accusations. The brutal attempt to frame Jada for the assassination squad was completely neutralized before a single arrest warrant could be officially drafted by the corrupted local authorities. But the military cyber operators had discovered something far more dangerous, hidden deep inside the seized intelligence servers. Kenneth Alvarez called my encrypted line, his voice tight with absolute disbelief. He reported that we had successfully destroyed their proxy network and secured the exonerating evidence. But the NSA analysts had cracked a deeply hidden partition on their primary server, revealing a completely different conspiracy. Arthur Sterling was not just using the intelligence firm to frame Jada for the warehouse hit. They found a massive digital vault containing highly classified, catastrophic blackmail material on the presiding trial judge, slated to handle Bradley's upcoming federal case. The digital vault, extracted by the military cyber operators, revealed a level of systemic corruption that would utterly shatter public faith in the local judiciary. Arthur Sterling had not simply paid off a few low-level court clerks to lose paperwork. He had compiled a devastating dossier of catastrophic blackmail material against the Honorable Thomas Wallace, the highly respected federal district judge officially slated to preside over Bradley's upcoming criminal trial. The heavily encrypted files contained undeniable proof of Judge Wallace's massive undisclosed gambling debts and a series of highly illegal offshore wire transfers used to actively conceal his crippling financial liabilities from the Internal Revenue Service. Marcus Thorne had meticulously prepared to weaponize this radioactive information. He planned to quietly present the illicit dossier to Judge Wallace in a private chambers meeting, implicitly demanding the complete and total dismissal of all charges against Bradley Kensington in exchange for absolute permanent silence. Arthur had essentially purchased the ultimate referee, guaranteeing that no matter how much digital evidence Kenneth Alvarez aggressively presented, the final verdict was already permanently bought and paid for by a desperate criminal. When Kenneth presented the terrifying scope of the blackmail scheme inside the secure walls of my downtown penthouse, the crushing reality of their absolute corruption hit Jada like a devastating physical blow. She sat at the long marble dining table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of untouched coffee, her eyes completely hollow with the sheer exhaustion of fighting an invisible, omnipresent enemy. She had barely survived the fabricated criminal charges, the brutal national media smear campaigns, and the malicious civil malpractice lawsuits explicitly designed to destroy her pristine surgical legacy. But discovering that the very foundation of the American justice system was fundamentally rigged against her broke something incredibly deep inside her resilient spirit. She looked across the table at me, her voice trembling with a profound, devastating sense of total and absolute defeat. "Dad," she whispered, her tone entirely devoid of hope. "They own the local police, they own the media networks, and they own the medical board. Now they own the federal judge who is supposed to hand down the final verdict. There is absolutely no limit to their wealth and their vicious cruelty. We are fighting a massive, heavily armored machine with our bare hands. Even with the NSA clearing my name of the hospital proxy frame-up, Bradley is still going to walk entirely free because the man holding the gavel is completely terrified of Arthur Sterling." She buried her face in her trembling hands, letting out a long, jagged sigh of sheer surrender. How do you fight a monster who can simply purchase his own absolute innocence? How do we ever expect to find true justice when the entire system is fundamentally broken and corrupted from the inside out? Her pain was a heavy, suffocating blanket wrapping around the entire room. She genuinely believed that Bradley's elite Wall Street privilege had completely and permanently insulated him from any genuine consequences for his violent actions. I did not offer her empty platitudes or hollow promises of eventual fairness. I operated in the exact same legal arena as Arthur Sterling, but I wielded a fundamentally different type of absolute power. True justice is never found in the passive hope that corrupt men will suddenly discover their moral compass. True justice is actively and violently extracted by forcing those corrupt men into a corner they cannot possibly escape. I stood up from the table and retrieved my heavy wool coat from the closet. You do not fight a corrupt machine by playing by its established rules, Jada, I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble of absolute, unwavering authority. You systematically dismantle the machine piece by piece until the arrogant operator has nowhere left to hide. I left the penthouse and ordered my secure government driver to take me directly to the private suburban residence of Judge Thomas Wallace. I did not bother calling ahead to schedule a polite judicial meeting. I arrived at his sprawling, manicured estate at exactly 6 in the morning, walking past his expensive imported vehicles and ringing the heavy brass doorbell with forceful, heavy strikes. When Judge Wallace opened the door, wearing a silk robe and holding a morning newspaper, his expression of mild, elite annoyance instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated panic when he recognized the senior federal judge standing aggressively on his front porch. I did not wait for a formal invitation. I stepped past him directly into his lavish foyer and dropped the thick, heavy NSA dossier directly onto his polished entryway table. The classified documents spilled open, revealing the exact dates, amounts, and offshore routing numbers of his illegal gambling debts. His face drained of all color, his breathing instantly becoming shallow and erratic as he stared at the absolute destruction of his entire judicial career, printed in stark, uncompromising black and white. Judge Wallace stumbled backward, heavily gripping the banister of his grand wooden staircase to prevent his knees from entirely buckling under the crushing weight of his sudden public exposure. "Everett," he stammered, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze of a cornered coward. "I can explain this. It is a massive misunderstanding. I was simply holding funds for a distant relative." I did not let him finish his pathetic, cowardly fabrication. I stepped forward, my physical presence entirely suffocating the remaining air in the lavish foyer. "You are severely compromised, Thomas," I stated, my voice carrying the absolute, unforgiving weight of the entire federal bench. "Arthur Sterling possesses this exact same digital footprint. He fully intended to use it to force a total legal dismissal of the Kensington trial this very morning. You have deeply disgraced the sacred robes you wear, and you have permanently forfeited your right to sit in judgment of any man. I am giving you exactly 1 hour to contact the federal clerk of courts and formally recuse yourself from the Kensington docket, citing sudden, severe medical complications. Immediately following your total recusal, you will submit your permanent, unalterable resignation from the federal judiciary. If you hesitate for a single second or attempt to warn Marcus Thorne of this conversation, I will personally hand this unredacted file to the Department of Justice Public Integrity Section. You will lose your federal pension, your physical freedom, and your entire historical legacy." By 9 that exact same morning, Marcus Thorne was confidently striding into the grand lobby of the federal courthouse, holding the official motion to dismiss Bradley's entire case. He was fully prepared to execute the blackmail against Judge Wallace and walk his arrogant corporate client out the front doors forever. His smug, victorious smile vanished instantly when the court clerk posted an emergency digital bulletin across the massive lobby monitors. Judge Thomas Wallace had permanently resigned from the federal bench, effective immediately. Before Marcus could even process the catastrophic loss of his ultimate corrupted asset, a heavily armed team of FBI agents surrounded him in the center of the lobby, placing a new, sealed federal indictment directly into his trembling hands. Inside, Arthur Sterling's heavily fortified private mansion, the atmosphere was thick with premature victory. Despite the recent federal raid on his corporate office and the sudden catastrophic resignation of Judge Wallace, Arthur remained entirely convinced of his own untouchable brilliance. He sat in his opulent leather recliner, swirling a glass of extremely rare vintage red wine. Marcus Thorne had just arrived from the downtown courthouse, delivering the news that the local prosecution was completely stalling. Without Wallace to actively manipulate, the local district attorney was struggling to piece together a coherent narrative from the chaotic aftermath. Arthur chuckled, a deep and arrogant sound echoing off the high ceilings. He looked at Bradley Kensington, who was pacing the Persian rug with nervous energy. "Relax, Bradley," Arthur commanded with absolute sheer confidence. "The local prosecutors are completely out of their depth. They built their entire foundation on local jurisdictions and weak financial statutes. Jada's medical files and the fragmented hospital server logs are simply not enough to secure a conviction in a standard state court. The jury will see a messy divorce, not a criminal mastermind. We have successfully muddied the waters so deeply that no local prosecutor will dare touch this toxic mess. You are going to walk entirely free." As if on cue, Marcus Thorne stepped forward, holding a single sheet of official court paper he had just received via a secure courier. He practically shoved the document into Bradley's hands. "It is completely over," Marcus announced, his voice ringing with pure, unadulterated triumph. "The district attorney office just filed a formal motion of nolle prosequi. They are officially dropping all state charges against you immediately. They formally stated that the evidentiary chain of custody was too severely compromised to proceed with a criminal trial." The sudden realization of his total, absolute victory washed over Bradley like a massive tidal wave. He stared at the official seal on the document, his eyes wide with sheer disbelief that rapidly morphed into intense, arrogant joy. He threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh that filled the entire mansion. He laughed at the local police. He laughed at the prosecutors. And most of all, he laughed at the pathetic memory of his former father-in-law. "I told you," Bradley shouted, tossing the paper onto the coffee table and grabbing a crystal glass to pour himself a massive celebratory drink. "I told you that old, uneducated laborer could never defeat me. He tried to play a high-stakes game of corporate chess with a Wall Street titan, and he completely humiliated himself. He probably spent his entire miserable life savings trying to hire a cheap lawyer to save his pathetic daughter, and he still lost. I am untouchable. I am going to buy a new mansion, start a new fund, and I am going to make absolutely sure Jada spends the rest of her miserable life paying off the civil debts I left behind." He raised his glass to Arthur and Marcus, toasting to his own manufactured brilliance. They had beaten the system, they had crushed the truth, and they were completely free. The arrogant sound of their clinking crystal glasses had not even faded from the room when a massive earth-shattering boom echoed from the front of the estate. The heavy, fortified iron gates of Arthur's private driveway did not just open, they were violently breached by a heavy armored transport vehicle. Before Arthur could even reach for his security monitor, the heavy oak doors of his private study were kicked entirely off their hinges. A highly coordinated tactical team of heavily armed Federal Bureau of Investigation agents flooded the room, their weapons drawn and laser sights instantly painting the chests of all three men. The local state police were nowhere to be seen. These were elite federal operators wearing tactical gear emblazoned with the imposing letters of the FBI. A tall, broad-shouldered special agent in charge stepped calmly through the shattered doorway, holding a thick, securely bound legal dossier. The absolute terror on Bradley's face returned, instantly freezing his victorious smile into a grotesque mask of sheer panic. The agent did not raise his voice, but his words carried the absolute unyielding authority of the United States government. "Bradley Kensington, Arthur Sterling, and Marcus Thorne," the agent announced, his voice slicing through the silent room like a razor blade. "The state charges against you were not dropped due to a lack of evidence. They were officially dismissed because the local jurisdiction was completely superseded by the federal government." The agent dropped the massive dossier directly onto the glass coffee table, right on top of their state dismissal paperwork. "You are officially being served with federal grand jury indictments. You are all under arrest for massive violations of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You are being charged with operating a continuous criminal enterprise, transnational money laundering, federal wire fraud, witness tampering, judicial bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. Under the RICO Act, the federal government is immediately freezing every single asset, domestic and foreign, linked to any of you. The entire weight of the federal justice system had just crashed down. The federal agents swiftly moved in, forcing Marcus and Bradley against the mahogany walls to secure them in heavy steel handcuffs. Arthur Sterling, however, remained frozen in his opulent leather chair. The sheer magnitude of a federal RICO indictment meant automatic maximum security federal prison for the rest of his natural life. There was no buying his way out of a RICO charge. The federal government had a 98% conviction rate, and they possessed the entirely decrypted hard drive from Chloe, the financial routing numbers from the Cayman Islands, and the exact digital footprint of the judicial blackmail scheme. Arthur's hands trembled violently as he slowly reached out and pulled the thick federal indictment dossier toward him. He ignored the long list of catastrophic felony charges and flipped directly to the final administrative page. As a veteran defense attorney, his only surviving instinct was to identify the exact federal judge assigned to preside over their initial arraignment and subsequent trial. He desperately hoped it was a judge he could somehow manipulate, delay, or bury in endless procedural motions. His eyes scanned the crisp black text of the official federal assignment roster. The document listed the courthouse, the specific federal district, and the exact courtroom number for tomorrow morning's mandatory hearing. Then his eyes slowly drifted down to the bold capitalized name of the presiding senior federal judge. Arthur's breathing stopped entirely. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving his skin a sickly ashen white. His fingers lost all their strength. The expensive crystal wine glass slipped completely from his trembling grip, hitting the hardwood floor and shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. The dark red wine pooled around his expensive shoes like blood. He slowly turned his head toward Bradley, who was currently fighting against the heavy steel handcuffs. Arthur's voice was a hollow, terrified whisper that barely carried across the room. "We are completely dead." The morning of the highly anticipated federal arraignment arrived with a crisp, freezing chill that bit aggressively through the city streets. Despite being arrested under the most severe and uncompromising federal racketeering statutes, Bradley Kensington utterly refused to look or act like a defeated man. His highly expensive legal team, led by the visibly sweating Marcus Thorne, had successfully petitioned the federal court to allow him to wear civilian clothing for his initial public appearance. He marched through the heavy metal detectors of the United States District Courthouse, wearing a flawless $5,000 custom-tailored Armani suit. His posture was perfectly straight, and his chin was held high, projecting the exact same toxic elite arrogance that had fueled his entire fraudulent financial empire. Even while actively facing a massive, undeniable mountain of federal RICO charges, he genuinely believed his pristine Wall Street charm and his aggressive corporate lawyers would somehow magically manufacture a miraculous legal loophole. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and shot a highly confident, practically radiant smile at the swarm of hungry reporters gathered behind the velvet ropes in the grand marble lobby. He was fully prepared to treat this massive federal courtroom exactly like a hostile corporate boardroom. He was going to dominate the physical space, heavily intimidate the prosecution, and walk out with his head held high, completely untouched by the consequences of his violent actions. Bradley confidently pushed through the swinging wooden gates, separating the gallery from the legal arena, and took his seat at the heavy mahogany defense table. Marcus Thorne sat nervously beside him, anxiously organizing thick stacks of legal files with trembling hands. But Bradley was not paying attention to his lawyer's desperate panic. His predatory eyes instantly scanned the sprawling courtroom, immediately locking onto the prosecution table. There, sitting perfectly still, with her head held high, was Jada. She wore a simple, elegant dark suit and projected an aura of absolute, unshakable resilience. Kenneth Alvarez sat beside her, looking incredibly relaxed and deeply dangerous. Bradley sneered, curling his lips into a vicious, highly contemptuous smirk, explicitly designed to break her composure and remind her of his dominance. He fully expected her to look terrified, broken, or completely crushed by the sheer weight of the legal battle ahead. But she did not even flinch at his aggressive psychological tactic. She simply stared right through his expensive suit, as if he were already a convicted ghost. Deeply frustrated by her absolute lack of fear, Bradley shifted his gaze toward the crowded wooden pews at the back of the sprawling courtroom. His eyes meticulously searched the rows of reporters, federal agents, and curious onlookers. He was specifically and aggressively hunting for one distinct face. He was eagerly looking for the pathetic, uneducated laborer who wore cheap, faded flannel shirts and drove a rusted truck. He desperately wanted to lock eyes with the old man who had foolishly dared to challenge a Wall Street titan. He wanted to see the absolute soul-crushing despair on his former father-in-law's face when he realized his pristine daughter was still trapped in a massive federal crossfire. He scanned every single row twice, but the old man was absolutely nowhere to be found. Bradley leaned back in his luxurious leather chair, letting out a soft, highly arrogant chuckle. He leaned over and whispered to Marcus, assuming the cowardly old servant was simply too terrified to step inside a real arena of ultimate power. He genuinely believed the pathetic old man had abandoned his daughter, realizing he was vastly out of his league. The sprawling federal courtroom was an absolute masterpiece of intimidating architectural design, meticulously crafted to make any defendant feel incredibly small. The soaring walls were paneled in rich dark oak, and the massive imposing seal of the United States Department of Justice loomed formidably behind the elevated judicial bench. The air inside the massive room was thick, with a heavy, suffocating tension that practically vibrated in the chest. Dozens of highly trained federal marshals stood perfectly still at every exit, their hands resting casually near their tactical holsters, projecting an aura of absolute zero tolerance for any disruption. The low murmuring of the aggressive press corps and the rapid shuffling of legal documents created a steady, nervous hum of intense anticipation. Everyone in the room knew this was not a standard financial fraud hearing. This was the highly anticipated, ruthless dismantling of a massive, violent criminal syndicate that had terrorized the city. Suddenly, the heavy side door leading directly to the private judicial chambers clicked open with a sharp metallic snap. The entire courtroom instantly fell dead silent. The nervous chatter completely evaporated, leaving a profound, heavy quiet that physically pressed down on the room like a weighted blanket. A towering, uniformed federal bailiff stepped forward, his voice booming with absolute unyielding authority, cutting through the heavy silence like a sharp surgical blade. "All rise," the bailiff commanded, his voice echoing perfectly off the high vaulted ceilings. "The United States District Court is now in session. All persons having business before this honorable court, draw near, give attention, and you shall be heard. God save the United States and this honorable court. Please remain standing for the Honorable Senior Federal Judge, Everett Sinclair." The deafening sound of 200 people simultaneously standing to their feet echoed like a sudden massive wave crashing against a stone wall. The heavy rhythmic sound of steady, highly deliberate footsteps emerged from the private shadows of the secure judicial corridor. A tall, commanding figure emerged, stepping confidently into the bright fluorescent light of the massive courtroom. He was draped entirely in the flowing midnight black robes of absolute federal authority. Every single movement he made projected a lifetime of unshakable discipline, total judicial dominance, and a fierce, uncompromising intellect. The heavy dark fabric swished quietly as he smoothly ascended the short wooden staircase leading directly to the highest elevated position in the entire room. He moved with a slow, calculated precision that commanded the immediate and total silent respect of every single person present in the gallery. He stood behind the massive wooden bench, looking out over the sprawling, silent courtroom, assessing the room with piercing, analytical eyes. The sheer gravity of his physical presence was entirely suffocating to those standing before him. He was the absolute apex predator of the American justice system, the final, uncompromising arbiter of truth and severe punishment. He slowly reached out his strong, steady hand and picked up the heavy, solid oak gavel, resting perfectly in the center of his elevated desk. Bradley Kensington stood perfectly straight at the defense table, his tailored suit immaculate and his arrogant smirk still plastered firmly across his handsome face. He slowly, casually lifted his gaze toward the towering judicial bench, fully expecting to see a manipulatable stranger holding the gavel of justice. Instead, the absolute breath vanished entirely from his lungs in a single, terrifying second. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his perfectly tanned skin a sickly, terrifying shade of ash white. His knees instantly buckled, causing him to violently grip the edge of the heavy mahogany defense table just to remain standing. The incredibly powerful man sitting on the highest throne of American justice, draped in the black robes of absolute federal power, was the exact same uneducated old laborer he had viciously humiliated at the mansion party. He was the man he had explicitly called a worthless servant. He was the man he had aggressively thrown a crumpled $100 bill at and ordered out the back door. The heavy oak gavel remained suspended in my hand for a brief, calculated second. Down at the defense table, Bradley Kensington was experiencing a complete, catastrophic physical shutdown. His perfectly manicured hands gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table so fiercely his knuckles turned entirely white. He tried to speak, to whisper to his attorney, but his throat simply refused to open. A pathetic, hollow gasp escaped his lips, sounding exactly like a drowning man desperately grasping for a single breath of air. His knees completely gave out beneath his tailored suit, forcing him to collapse heavily into his luxurious leather chair. He stared up at me with eyes wide and utterly consumed by sheer primal terror. The arrogant, untouchable Wall Street titan, who had confidently strutted into my courtroom mere minutes ago, had entirely evaporated. In his place sat a broken, terrified child, realizing he was permanently trapped in a cage with the apex predator he had foolishly mocked. His mind scrambled violently to process the impossible reality. The poor, uneducated servant he had humiliated and thrown a crumpled $100 bill at was the exact man holding his absolute survival in the palm of his hands. He was entirely at my absolute mercy. Marcus Thorne, the highly aggressive corporate lawyer who had assumed complete control of the defense after Arthur Sterling was arrested, noticed his client completely breaking down. Marcus followed Bradley's horrified gaze up to the towering judicial bench. It took the seasoned defense attorney exactly 3 seconds to connect the dots and realize the catastrophic conflict of interest threatening to obliterate his entire defense strategy. Panic instantly flooded his sharp features. He scrambled to his feet so fast, his heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the courtroom floor, echoing loudly through the silent room. "Your Honor," Marcus shouted, his voice pitching upward with aggressive, desperate urgency. "The defense strongly and formally objects to these entire proceedings. We demand an immediate emergency recess and a total suspension of this trial." Marcus pointed a trembling finger toward the bench, his composure completely fracturing under the immense pressure. This is a severe and unprecedented legal conflict of interest. The presiding judge is the defendant's direct father-in-law. This entire federal prosecution is nothing more than a personal vendetta, a calculated family revenge plot designed to punish my client over a domestic civil dispute. You cannot legally sit in judgment of your own family member. We formally demand a new judge be assigned immediately to prevent a blatant miscarriage of justice. A wave of shocked murmurs erupted throughout the crowded gallery. The hungry press corps frantically scribbled notes, leaning forward to witness the explosive legal drama unfolding before their eyes. The prosecution table remained perfectly silent. Kenneth Alvarez did not even bother to stand up or voice a counter-objection. He simply sat back in his chair, crossing his arms, and waiting for me to execute the precise legal maneuver we had prepared for this exact moment. Marcus Thorne continued to shout, demanding the trial be halted, declaring the entire federal indictment compromised. I sat perfectly still, looking down at the frantic defense attorney and the terrified defendant. A cold, calculated smile slowly formed on my face, sending a visible shiver down Bradley's spine. I reached into the breast pocket of my heavy black robes and retrieved my wire-rimmed reading glasses, placing them deliberately on my face. I then picked up a crisp, white legal document, resting perfectly in the center of my desk. I held the paper up, the official state seal, catching the bright fluorescent lights of the massive courtroom. "Counselor Thorne," I said, my voice a low, dangerous rumble that instantly silenced the murmuring gallery. "You are making a very serious accusation regarding my judicial integrity, based entirely on a fundamentally false assumption. I am not the defendant's father-in-law. I am not legally related to your client in any capacity whatsoever." Marcus Thorne stopped his aggressive shouting, looking utterly confused. Bradley stared up at me, his jaw completely slack. I looked directly into Bradley's terrified eyes and delivered the fatal legal blow. "I hold in my hand an official certified decree from the state family court," I announced, projecting my voice so every single reporter in the room could hear the absolute truth. 2 months ago, my daughter filed a formal petition for an absolute annulment of her marriage to the defendant. She presented undeniable, documented evidence that the marriage was orchestrated under severe fraudulent pretenses, identity manipulation, and profound financial deception. The family court judge completely agreed, declaring the union void from its inception. This document officially states that the marriage between Dr. Jada Sinclair and Bradley Kensington never legally existed. It has been entirely erased from the public record. Your client is not my son-in-law. He is simply a standard federal defendant standing before a completely impartial judge. To me, he is nothing more than a stranger accused of highly violent and severe federal crimes. The absolute finality of my statement struck the defense table like a massive physical weight. Marcus Thorne stood frozen in the middle of the courtroom, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His entire aggressive strategy to derail the federal trial, based on a familial conflict of interest, was completely obliterated before it could even begin. He frantically flipped through his thick legal binders, desperately searching for a procedural loophole or a technicality that could save them. But there was absolutely nothing left to exploit. The annulment was airtight, legally binding, and entirely unchallengeable. He could not remove me from the bench. He could not delay the federal trial. He was hopelessly trapped in my courtroom, facing a mountain of undeniable digital evidence and a judge who intimately understood every single fraudulent tactic his client had utilized. Marcus slowly sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, knowing he had absolutely no legal ammunition left to fire. Bradley sank further into his leather chair, looking as if the very air had been sucked out of the massive room. He looked over at Jada, expecting to see a broken woman, but she simply stared back at him with absolute fierce defiance. The untouchable Wall Street titan realized he had been completely outplayed by the exact same people he had arrogantly underestimated. I removed my reading glasses and set them gently on the desk. I picked up the heavy, solid oak gavel, feeling the immense weight of the federal justice system resting perfectly in my hand. I looked down at the pale, trembling man who had once dared to order me out the back door of my own property. I brought the gavel down with a sharp, deafening crack that echoed violently off the high, vaulted ceilings like a gunshot. "Motion completely denied," I declared, my voice ringing with absolute, uncompromising authority. "Let the trial begin, Mr. Kensington." The legal massacre began with the swift and brutal precision of a military strike. Kenneth Alvarez stepped up to the prosecution podium and systematically dismantled Bradley Kensington's entire existence. There was no theatrical grandstanding or unnecessary legal posturing, just the cold, hard delivery of undeniable facts. Kenneth presented the jury with high-definition thermal video of Bradley firing a suppressed weapon into the decoy bed at the suburban safe house, confirming premeditated attempted murder. He played the crystal-clear audio recordings captured from Jada's designer handbag, where Bradley coldly outlined his master plan to frame his own wife for a $50 million embezzlement scheme. Ken projected the highly encrypted offshore bank routing numbers onto the massive courtroom screens, visually tracing the exact path of the stolen funds from local shell companies directly to the Cayman Islands. He handed the jury the completely forged executive board approvals, proving definitively that Bradley had violently manipulated Jada's identity to serve as his primary human shield. Every single piece of digital evidence was a heavy nail driven deep into the coffin of Bradley's defense. Marcus Thorne sat completely frozen at the defense table, offering zero objections because there was absolutely no legal defense against a towering mountain of irrefutable truth. The final devastating blow to the defense came when Kenneth called his star witness to the stand. The heavy courtroom doors opened, and Chloe, the former chief corporate accountant and Bradley's secret mistress, walked confidently down the center aisle. She took the witness stand and swore an oath to tell the absolute truth, having traded her absolute loyalty to Bradley for total federal immunity. She looked down at the defense table with an expression of pure clinical detachment, completely stripping away the polished facade Bradley had worn for years. Under Kenneth's sharp questioning, Chloe laid bare the entire grotesque anatomy of the Ponzi scheme. She detailed exactly how Bradley had panicked when legitimate funding dried up, turning to violent underground syndicates to keep his luxurious lifestyle afloat. She told the completely silent courtroom how Bradley had specifically targeted Jada for her immense medical trust fund, grooming her and isolating her solely to use her as a highly credible scapegoat. "He is not a brilliant Wall Street mastermind," Chloe testified, her voice echoing clearly through the massive room. "He is a terrifyingly weak and desperate coward." When the federal regulators started closing in, he begged me to help him forge Dr. Sinclair's signature. He was fully prepared to let an innocent woman rot in a maximum security prison while he drank champagne on a foreign beach. He does not care about anyone or anything other than his own reflection and his bank accounts. Bradley squirmed violently in his leather chair, his face turning a deep shade of furious red as his former closest ally completely dismantled his ego in front of the entire world. Chloe exposed his pathetic begging during their frantic drive to the private airfield, and his absolute terror when the syndicate began hunting him. She painted a vivid, uncompromising portrait of a man entirely consumed by greed and utterly devoid of a fundamental human soul. The sheer humiliation of being publicly exposed by his own accomplice finally shattered the very last remnants of Bradley's fragile sanity. The arrogant, untouchable elite armor he had worn his entire life violently fractured into a million jagged pieces. He could no longer handle the crushing reality of his absolute defeat. He suddenly shoved his heavy wooden chair backward with a loud, aggressive scrape that startled the nearby federal marshals. Ignoring the desperate, frantic warnings of his defense attorney, Bradley lunged forward and violently snatched the heavy microphone directly from the defense table. His face was contorted into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure, unhinged rage. "You think you have won!" he screamed, his voice cracking with absolute madness, spittle flying from his mouth. He pointed a trembling, furious finger directly up at the judicial bench, his eyes burning with a deep, venomous hatred. "You are nothing but a pathetic, uneducated thug playing dress-up in a stolen robe. You think putting on a black suit makes you my equal. You are just a filthy servant. You are a disgusting street-level laborer who got lucky." Bradley completely lost all control of his higher functions, hurling the most vile, sickening, and historically violent racist slurs directly at the presiding senior federal judge. He paced wildly behind the defense table, spewing a deeply toxic venom that exposed the profound, deeply ingrained bigotry he had always harbored beneath his expensive tailored suits. He screamed that his wealth and his bloodline inherently made him superior, demanding the entire courtroom recognize his absolute supreme authority. He called the jury a collection of pathetic peasants, and threatened to buy the entire judicial district just to have me fired and destroyed. He was actively and aggressively digging his own permanent grave with every single word, plunging deeper into a dark, irreversible abyss of his own making. The entire federal courtroom was completely paralyzed by the sudden, violent outburst. The press corps stopped typing, their mouths hanging open in sheer disbelief. The 12 members of the federal jury recoiled in their seats, absolutely horrified by the grotesque display of unadulterated hatred and unchecked privilege. Marcus Thorne buried his face in his hands, knowing his legal career was effectively over. The heavily armed federal marshals instantly unholstered their tactical restraints, stepping aggressively toward the defense table to neutralize the threat. But I raised my hand in a simple, silent gesture, halting the guards instantly. I did not bang my wooden gavel. I did not shout for order. I did not show a single microscopic ounce of anger or personal offense. I simply sat perfectly still behind the elevated bench, allowing the heavy microphone to broadcast his true, monstrous nature to the entire world. I wanted the jury to witness the absolute, unfiltered reality of Bradley Kensington. I wanted them to see the profound, sickening rot that lived beneath his expensive cologne and his charming smile. I let his vile, racist tirade echo off the rich oak walls until he had completely exhausted his lungs, leaving him gasping for air in the center of the silent, horrified room. When his manic screaming finally subsided into heavy, desperate panting, I lowered my hand. "Bailiffs," I said, my voice a low, cutting blade of absolute authority. "Force the defendant into his seat and secure him immediately." The marshals moved with brutal efficiency, pushing a completely spent Bradley down into his heavy wooden chair and locking his wrists to the table. "Members of the jury," I instructed calmly, "you are officially dismissed to begin your final deliberations." As the jury quickly filed out of the room, Bradley looked up at me. The manic rage in his eyes was instantly replaced by a deep, hollow, and absolute terror. He realized he had just lost everything. The heavy oak doors to the deliberation room closed with a resounding thud, leaving the sprawling federal courtroom in a state of agonizing, suspended animation. The silence in the massive chamber was thick and suffocating, pressing down heavily on the defense table where Bradley Kensington sat shackled and visibly hyperventilating. He stared intensely at the large analog clock on the paneled wall, watching the thin second hand sweep away the final fleeting moments of his luxurious freedom. Exactly 30 minutes later, a sharp electronic buzz echoed violently through the silent chamber. The jury had already reached a unanimous decision, a deliberation that, incredibly brief for a highly complex, multi-layered federal racketeering case, signaled absolute, undeniable, and overwhelming certainty. The stern federal bailiff instructed the packed gallery to rise as the 12 men and women solemnly filed back into their designated seats. They refused to even glance in Bradley's direction, keeping their eyes locked firmly forward. I looked directly at the jury foreperson, a retired public school teacher with a posture of absolute resolve, and asked if they had reached a verdict. She stood up tall, holding the official sealed documents with a remarkably steady hand. "We have, Your Honor," she stated clearly, her voice carrying to the very back of the room. "For the charge of transnational money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. For the charge of federal wire fraud, guilty. For witness tampering, guilty. For conspiracy to commit murder, guilty." She read through all 12 catastrophic felony charges, her voice never wavering for a single second. 12 counts, 12 resounding, inescapable declarations of absolute guilt. Bradley slumped violently forward, his chest heaving erratically as the crushing reality of a dozen massive federal convictions completely collapsed his lungs. His highly aggressive, previously arrogant defense attorney actively shifted his chair away from him, physically and professionally distancing himself from a legally radioactive convict. I slowly reached up and removed my wire-rimmed reading glasses, folding them with deliberate, calculated precision, and placing them gently on the elevated wooden desk. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the polished mahogany, and fixed my gaze entirely on the broken, weeping man chained to the defense table. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. The aggressive reporters stopped scribbling, their recording devices capturing every single second of the historic judicial moment about to unfold. "Mr. Kensington," I began, my voice projecting a low, resonant, and deeply penetrating gravity that commanded absolute total attention. "You have lived your entire existence under the profoundly toxic, deeply dangerous delusion that wealth inherently equates to superior moral authority. You genuinely believed that wearing a custom-tailored suit and manipulating invisible offshore accounts gave you the divine, untouchable right to destroy innocent lives, to steal from the vulnerable, and to violently eliminate anyone who dared to stand in the path of your boundless greed. You looked at the world through a deeply distorted lens of extreme privilege, aggressively sorting humanity into categories of predators and prey, masters and servants. Several months ago, in the grand foyer of a $10 million estate that you did not even own, you looked down at an older black man quietly wiping up a spilled glass of wine. You did not see a human being. You saw a target for your misplaced arrogance. You threw a crumpled $100 bill into a puddle of spilled wine and ordered me to leave through the back door. You looked me directly in the eye and sneered with utter disgust, explicitly calling me just a servant. I paused, letting the profound, devastating weight of that specific memory hang heavily in the silent, captivated courtroom. Bradley stared up at me, his eyes overflowing with hot, desperate tears of ultimate, undeniable defeat. He was physically trembling, his expensive suit now hanging on him like a ragged shroud. "You were absolutely right, Bradley," I continued, my voice rising with an unshakable, righteous power that filled every corner of the vast room. "I am a servant. I do not serve corporate greed. I do not serve the fragile, inflated egos of Wall Street titans. I have spent the last 40 years of my life proudly serving a master far more powerful, far more enduring, and far more demanding than any offshore bank account you could ever construct. I serve justice. I serve the fundamental, unyielding rule of law that dictates no man, regardless of how much money he hides in the Caribbean, is ever above the severe consequences of his own violent actions. You falsely assumed that because my hands were calloused and my shirt was faded, I possessed no actual power. But true power does not reside in a luxury vehicle or an exclusive executive boardroom. True power is the profound ability to stand firmly in the blinding light of the truth and hold the wicked entirely accountable for their darkness. Today, the very judicial system you openly mocked, the very people you explicitly called pathetic peasants, have looked closely at the absolute truth of your monstrous character. They have evaluated your immense cruelty, your violent racism, and your complete lack of basic human empathy. And today, the ultimate master I serve demands that you pay the absolute highest price for your devastation. You tried to build an illegal empire on the broken back of my innocent daughter. You tried to discard her into a federal cage while you plotted to flee to a desert paradise. But you failed spectacularly because you fundamentally misunderstood who you were fighting. Bradley began to openly weep, a pathetic, high-pitched sobbing that echoed miserably off the rich oak walls, stripping away his final shred of false dignity. It is the formal, uncompromising duty of this federal court to ensure that a predatory individual of your magnitude is never permitted to walk freely among civilized society again, I stated, my voice echoing with final, absolute, irrevocable judgment. Bradley Kensington, for the 12 severe federal felony convictions handed down by this impartial jury, including massive racketeering, financial fraud, and the premeditated attempted murder of Dr. Jada Sinclair, I hereby sentence you to serve 85 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. You are explicitly and permanently denied any possibility of parole, early release, or executive clemency. You will serve every single day of this brutal sentence until the end of your natural life. I picked up the heavy, solid oak gavel, wrapping my fingers tightly around the smooth handle. Bradley screamed, begging loudly for a mercy he had never once shown to anyone else in his entire life. I brought the gavel down with a final, deafening strike that permanently sealed his fate. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber like a violent thunderclap, officially closing the chapter on his fraudulent, destructive existence. "Take him away," I ordered coldly. The heavily armed federal marshals grabbed his arms and hauled the sobbing, completely broken man out of the courtroom, dragging him kicking and screaming into the dark, unforgiving shadows of the federal justice system forever. 6 months later, the sterile, unyielding, and brutal reality of a federal supermax prison had entirely consumed Bradley Kensington. Stripped permanently of his tailored Armani suits and his false bravado, he wore a rough, bright orange jumpsuit, kneeling miserably on the cold, unforgiving concrete floor. His once perfectly manicured hands were now raw, bleeding, and heavily blistered as he aggressively scrubbed the stainless steel bowl of a filthy prison toilet, finally and permanently becoming the actual, literal servant he had once so viciously mocked. Far away from that concrete nightmare, under the warm, golden, peaceful glow of a beautiful suburban sunset, I stood quietly in my blooming backyard garden, comfortably wearing my favorite faded red flannel shirt. I peacefully watered the vibrant green plants, taking deep breaths of the fresh, clean air. Jada walked over, looking completely radiant and fully restored. She rested her head gently on my shoulder, a bright, beautiful, and entirely unbroken smile illuminating her face as we watched the sun go down together. The screen faded slowly to black, leaving only 4 bold, glowing white words burning into the darkness. Justice was served. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true power never needs to announce its presence. Bradley looked at a faded flannel shirt and calloused hands, and saw only a target for his own insecurities and vile prejudice. He was blinded by the toxic illusion that wealth equals superiority. He failed to realize that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the keys to the kingdom. Character and integrity will always outlast cheap designer suits and stolen money. Never underestimate anyone based on their appearance, because the person you demean today might just be the architect of your downfall tomorrow. If you believe that true justice always catches up to arrogant bullies, please leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel for more stories of ultimate payback.